Welcome, everyone. I am Brian Keith, host of the channel City of the Immaculata on YouTube. I will be moderating today's debate. The debate resolution is whether the prophecy of Daniel 9 is better evidence for Catholicism or Judaism. Arguing for the Catholic position, we have Gideon Lazar, also known as the Byzantine Scotist. Gideon, if you would like, just take a minute to introduce yourself, please.
Hello, yes, my name is Gideon Lazar. I was raised in a Jewish family, so I'm halakhically Jewish. For those who don't know, that just means legally, under Jewish law, I am Jewish. But I don't want to give anyone any false impressions. I was not raised in a very religious Jewish family or anything like that. And before becoming a Christian, I considered myself an atheist. Then in high school, I became a Christian, and I eventually found my way into the Catholic Church, where I am now. So yeah, it's my background.
Excellent. Arguing for the Jewish position, we have Tractatus. If you would, please introduce yourself to everyone.
Yeah, hi. I'm an internet and non-Orthodox Jew. Similar to Gideon, I also grew up in a Jewish home, but I was not raised religiously at all. In fact, my father's actually lapsed Catholic. My mother's Jewish. And yeah, I came to Judaism later in life when I was in college and have been practicing since then.
Great. So the debate format will be 20 minutes opening for each speaker. Then we will have 15-minute rebuttals for each, followed by 20-minute cross-examinations each. Then we will do 10 minutes of audience Q&A, and then we'll finish up with 10 minutes of closings for each. I would just ask that you guys in the audience hold off on sending your questions. I'll let you know the appropriate time to really start sending them in. Gideon will be going first, and when you are ready, Gideon, your 20 minutes begins when you start speaking.
Here we go. First, I want to thank Tractatus for agreeing to this debate and Brian for agreeing to moderate it. Unfortunately, I think a lot of debates between Jews and Christians online do not engage with the rich theological traditions of these religions. Since I am Catholic, I will not defend any generic form of Christianity, but specifically that version which was established by Jesus of Nazareth 2,000 years ago, the Catholic Church. As one who is halakhically Jewish, I also have great love for my fellow Jews, even if we disagree greatly on religious matters. I hope our debate today can help elevate the discourse, as well as make manifest which religion is true. Our debate today is about the last 4 verses of the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel. In this chapter, the prophet Daniel is pondering the prophecies of Jeremiah. Jeremiah had prophesied that after 70 years of exile, the Jews would be able to return home and a new covenant would come. However, these years were nearly up, and the people remained in exile, and the city of Jerusalem lay in waste. To console him, the angel Gabriel visits Daniel and gives him a prophecy, and the translation here is my own. 70 weeks have been determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to end vision and prophecy, and to anoint the Holy of Holies. Know and understand that from the going forth of a word to restore and build Jerusalem until an anointed prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And the city and the wall will be built again in troublesome times. And after 62 weeks, an anointed one will be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and it shall end with a flood. And until the end of the war, desolations are determined. And he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will make sacrifices and offerings to cease. And on the wing of abominations will be a desolator, until the determined destruction is poured out on the desolator. So this is a very difficult prophecy to even translate, let alone to understand. However, since it is understood very differently by Jews and Christians, and since it gives a very specific timetable which can be compared against secular records, it provides a very important test case for comparing the truth claims of Judaism and Christianity. If this is a prophecy of Jesus of Nazareth, and if he perfectly fulfilled it, then he is indeed who he says he was. It is important to contextualize this prophecy. Near the beginning of his prophetic career, Daniel sees a statue representing a series of 4 kingdoms. Later, he sees 4 beasts, once again representing 4 kingdoms. And these 4 kingdoms are agreed by Jews and Christians to be Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. In each vision, the 4th kingdom is followed by an everlasting kingdom, that is the Messianic kingdom. After this prophecy in Daniel 9, Daniel receives one more vision, detailing events that are to occur after his death. These very clearly give a series of events from the time of Persia until the end of the 1st century BC. Thus, while Daniel wishes for the Messianic age to begin right after the 70 years of exile, Gabriel comes to tell him there is going to be a second period of time. This period is referred to as the 70 weeks, which both Jews and Christians agree is the 70 weeks of years. The weeks are given for 6 reasons. The first 3, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, and to atone for iniquity, all deal with different sorts of wrongdoing against God. The proper atonements for them are explained in Leviticus. Notably, though, the only place where all 3 words show up together in Leviticus is Leviticus 16, which gives the instructions for Yom Kippur, that is the Day of Atonement. To bring in everlasting righteousness refers to the everlasting kingdom spoken of in the other prophecies of Daniel. To end vision and prophecy refers to the completion of the giving of revelation, which perhaps is connected to the giving of a new covenant in Jeremiah 33. Finally, to anoint the Holy of Holies is the most obscure of these, but once again alludes to Yom Kippur, the one day the high priest, often referred to in Leviticus as an anointed one, could enter the Holy of Holies and anoint the Ark of the Covenant with the blood of sacrifices. Taken together, these verses seem to refer to a final Yom Kippur-like event which takes away sin, along with a new covenant and an eternal messianic, that is anointed kingdom. The prophecy is said to begin with a word, davar in Hebrew. And I apologize for my Hebrew pronunciations. I'm not great at pronouncing Hebrew. The Jewish commentators think this refers back to the davar of Jeremiah in verse 2. However, the count would begin when Jeremiah gave his prophecy. However, the davar is immediately qualified as lehashiv v'livnot Yerushalayim, to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. The prepositional lamed specifies these infinitives as giving the purpose of the davar. This davar therefore refers to a decree to rebuild Jerusalem after the exile. The book of Ezra and Nehemiah records 4 decrees by Persian kings about the restoration of Jerusalem. However, the first 2 only deal with the rebuilding of the temple, not the city, and the last has only to do with the repairing of the walls, again, not the city itself. The only decree which has to do with the restoration of the city itself, including its government, is the decree in the 7th year of Artaxerxes I in Ezra 7. We know from secular records, as I will prove later, that this decree was given in 457 BC. This, therefore, is the start of the count. The 70 weeks seem to be broken up into multiple sections. This is where punctuation becomes very important. The punctuation of the Masoretic text seems to break it up into 3 sections. 7 weeks for the coming of an anointed prince, 62 weeks for the rebuilding of the city, and 1 week for a strong covenant. However, the punctuation marks in the Masoretic text come from between the 7th and 10th centuries, long after Christianity and Judaism split. While punctuation marks can be helpful, these scribes were in no better place than anyone else to know where the correct marks should be. Thus, we cannot regard these punctuation marks as certain. The text could easily be punctuated to lump the 7 and 62 weeks into a single 69-week period. Indeed, all ancient translations of Daniel, whether the Old Greek, the Theodotian, the Peshitta, or the Vulgate, do not separate these weeks. A parallel example for this Hebrew phrasing is in Ezekiel 45:12, where 60 shekels is instead referred to as 20 shekels and 25 shekels and 15 shekels. Finally, even if the Atnak is retained as in the Masoretic text, there is also an Atnak in the middle of verse 24 that, if interpreted as a full verse, would break the flow of that verse. Thus, the text can easily be divided into the 69-week period for the coming of an anointed prince and the rebuilding of the city, followed by a 1-week period for a strong covenant. Why would the first 49 years be singled out, though? 49 years is the length of a jubilee. The full period of 490 years is 10 jubilees. This helps us understand the nature of the weeks. During the exile, the practice of sabbatical years was not kept. When Ezra returned in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, he resumed this practice once again, since his whole mission was to encourage the keeping of the law. This is confirmed in Nehemiah 10, where Ezra reads the whole law on a sabbatical year in accordance with Deuteronomy 30, 10-12. Counting inclusively, the 20th year of Artaxerxes, which is when Nehemiah takes place, would be the 14th year of the first Jubilee cycle, and hence a sabbatical year. Notably, that Ezra's entrance into the land restarted the Jubilee cycle also appears in the Seder Olam Rabbah. Two things are said to occur during these 69 weeks. Firstly, there's the coming of an anointed prince. Here the word for anointed is Mashiach. Many Jewish commentators object at this point that it is not HaMashiach, i.e. the Messiah, but only a Messiah. Thus it could refer to any anointed prince. This is true. Nonetheless, in the context of the other prophecies in Daniel, which are messianic, we should expect this prophecy to be messianic as well. In fact, the flurry of messianic fervor in the 1st century AD suggests that many ancient Jews thought this prophecy was about the Messiah and was about to be fulfilled. Even Rashi, who identifies both messiahs in this passage as other anointed men, nonetheless inserts a third unmentioned messiah into this passage. Quote, "And the ruling of the abomination will endure until the day that the destruction and extermination decreed upon it will befall it, in the days of the King Messiah." So it is not unreasonable, then, to see these 69 weeks as the time for the coming of the Messiah. Near the end of these weeks, Jesus is born. The complete fulfillment, Jesus' anointing by the Holy Spirit at his baptism, then occurs right after the 69 weeks are complete, as these weeks are until the coming of an anointed prince. The exact date for Jesus' baptism is disputed, but it is somewhere between AD 27 and 29. Anything in this range places Jesus' baptism right after the completion of these weeks. I lean towards AD 27, and interestingly, this places Jesus' baptism pretty much immediately after the 69 weeks. But if the other were correct, it would not change much here. Secondly, Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt again in these weeks. Jerusalem had to be rebuilt a number of times in this period, such as under Ezra, Nehemiah, the Maccabees, and Herod. Next, a number of events are said to occur after the 62 weeks. Firstly, an anointed one will be cut off. Well, technically, this could be a different person than the first anointed one. It seems more likely they are the same person. In the 7 and 62 weeks, the anointed comes, and then after that, the anointed is cut off. Cut off can mean to be killed or to be accursed. Notably, Jesus was killed by being hung upon a tree, a sign that he was accursed. While the proper translation of Ve'ein Lo is obscure, it most likely means, but not for himself. Thus, like the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, he is deemed to be killed as a wicked man, but in reality he was perfectly righteous. Secondly, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Who is to come suggests that this prince is different from the earlier anointed prince. This part of the prophecy is agreed by Jews and Christians to be about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. While this therefore occurs outside the period of the 70 weeks, the prophecy just says this has to occur after the 62 weeks, not necessarily within the 70 weeks. Indeed, it occurred shortly after and in close connection with the events in the 70 weeks, since Jesus prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem as divine punishment for Jerusalem's rejection of her Messiah. Third, it will end with a flood. Since there was no literal flood in the 1st century AD, this must be metaphorical. There is perhaps an allusion to the flood of Noah, which brought in a new creation. Jesus bringing in a new creation is one of the central themes of the New Testament. The temple, the central sign of the old creation, was destroyed and replaced with the church, the central sign of the new creation. Fourth, there are desolations which are determined. This word most often in the Tanakh is used to refer to the exile of the people, but here it is likely used in the sense of Ezekiel 6:4, which refers to God abandoning the temple. The first such desolation was by Antiochus, but it also occurred shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple, as I will later show is attested by the Talmud. This repeated rejection of Christ in the church by the Jerusalem establishment caused God to finally leave the temple and let it be destroyed, just as it had been in the days of Ezekiel. This destruction is brought about by one on the wings of abomination. The meaning of this is obscure, so I will leave any discussion of this aside unless my opponent wishes to discuss this. Finally, we hear about the last week. During this week, a covenant is made. This refers to the new covenant brought about by Jesus. In the middle of the week, sacrifices are said to cease. Yoma 39b in the Talmud records that, starting in AD 30, God ceased to accept the sacrifices of Yom Kippur. The new covenant had come, and hence the old had begun to fall away. Well, the exact date of Jesus' crucifixion is disputed. It was sometime between AD 30 and 33, which places it in this week. Notably, if Jesus was crucified in AD 30, then this means he instituted the sacrifice of the Mass on the Passover of AD 30, and then fulfilled the feast of Yom Kippur by ascending into the heavenly Holy of Holies. In Daniel 7, we see one like a son of man, agreed by Jews and Christians to be the Messiah, ascend on a cloud to the Ancient of Days. This recalls the high priest on Yom Kippur, ascending in a cloud of incense into God's presence in the Holy of Holies. Connecting with all the language of Daniel 9 then, Jesus comes to anoint the heavenly Holy of Holies with his blood, thereby finishing the transgression, making an end to sin, and atoning for iniquity. In the sacrifice of the Mass, the priest is united to this heavenly sacrifice. The sacrifices of the old law, the sacrifice of the new covenant thus replaces those of the old. This was finally consummated in AD 70 when the sacrifices of the temple became impossible to bring. Since the AD 30 date of the crucifixion is disputed, though, I won't press this point too hard. What is important is that God ceased to accept the sacrifices of Yom Kippur, itself a culmination of the whole sacrificial system in AD 30, the middle of the week. If Jesus was crucified in AD 33, this would just mean that God gave a sign of the sacrificial system upon the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Right? We see all sorts of things when Jesus first comes in, such as the opening of heaven at his baptism. Interestingly, while we see Jesus participating in many biblical feasts in the Gospels, we never see him participating in Yom Kippur. Yoma 39b also mentions that the doors of the sanctuary were opened as a prophecy of the coming of the destruction of the temple. Perhaps this is a corruption of the tradition of the veil and the temple tearing, or something else that happened at the same time as another sign. This shifts us to the last important question. How do we know any of the dates I just gave, which follow the standard chronology of ancient history, are correct? Our best evidence comes from Ptolemy's canon. This gives a list of ancient kings and the lengths of their rules from 747 BC to AD 160. The reigns of these kings and their dates are correlated with around 800 years of astronomical data. This means that this is accurate data passed down from the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks and eventually to the Romans. Furthermore, the kings of this canon and the lengths of their reigns are attested to in many other ancient sources, such as Greek historians, Babylonian and Persian tablets, Manetho's list of Egyptian pharaohs, among many other records. So I show here, for example, that from almost every ruler of Babylon, we have tablets from Babylon showing when they started and when they ended their reigns. This creates an interlocking series of records, which gives us a pretty good picture of the late 7th century BC and onwards, because there would have had to have been essentially a global conspiracy to change multiple different cultures' records at the same time to make our chronology of this period not correct. Richard Parker and Waldo Dublin state in their book, Babylonian Chronology 626 BC to AD 75, a standard reference for the work for the chronology of this period. Quote, "It is possible that a certain number of dates in our table may be wrong by 1 day, but as they are for purely historical purposes, this uncertainty is unimportant." This is quite a bold claim, but their extensive list of ancient sources for the reigns of the rulers of Babylon provides strong evidence that this claim is correct. While for earlier periods in history, we might not have as much evidence for the standard of chronology, and I think those periods are much more open to revision. There is no doubt that our standard chronology of this period is very, very precise. To summarize, therefore, in Daniel 9, Daniel receives a prophecy that between the years of AD 27 and 33, a Messiah would come to bring about a new covenant, an end to sin, and a messianic kingdom, and that he would die for someone else. The only person who possibly fulfills all of this is Jesus of Nazareth. Since Jesus established the Catholic Church as messianic kingdom, this proves the truth of the Catholic faith, especially to Jews who do accept that Daniel is a true prophet. Well, the Jewish people have an important role to play in divine providence, for to us were entrusted the oracles of God, and we remain beloved for the sake of our forefathers. We did not realize the fulfillment of our own scriptures when they came. Well, the sages of the Talmud say that the Messiah would have come 2,000 years ago if our righteousness had merited. We should have realized that he did come, but our sins blinded us to his coming. Whenever there is a positive prophecy, the sages say that will always be fulfilled. It's only negative prophecies which might not be fulfilled on repentance, but positive prophecies will always be fulfilled. And it is important for us to realize our mistake and finally accept our Messiah and his kingdom. Thank you. I yield the rest of my time there.
All right. Thank you, Gideon. Tractatus, I will give you a second to get your slides set up, and when you start speaking, I will hit the clock.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. All right, I think I have my document loaded. I'm going to press present, and let's hope this goes. File share screen. Here we go. Awesome. There it is. Okay, this took a little bit. Okay. All right, let's start the clock. Okay. For anything else, I just wanted to have a couple of brief slides dedicated to acknowledgements, disclosures. I'm going to move to this very quickly. I apologize to the audience if I slip into any Hebrew that's unfamiliar. The moderator and Gideon can feel free to interrupt me if I'm saying anything which is unclear. I speak fast. I'm from the East Coast, and I only got 20 minutes. I got a lot to say, so we're going to try and roll through this as quickly as possible. First and foremost, of course, I want to give praise to Gideon for proposing and hosting this debate. I'm very happy to have this conversation. Brian, thank you very much for moderating. I, like Gideon, also feel that the Christian-Jewish dialogue right now, especially on the internet, is at very low ebb, and I hope that this debate is going to foster better intellectual discourse amongst us. I also want to praise Gideon for having the wisdom to limit the scope of the debate to a very narrow topic. A narrow topic which, of course, is very broad when one starts to dig into it. But, the idea that, Jews and Christians would just be able to kind of come and talk, or Jews and Catholics would be able to just come and talk, in general, I don't think much is accomplished in those conversations. But if you focus on a very specific topic, then a lot can be done. My intent here, I just want to be a disclaimer because I realize that most of the audience is probably going to be Catholic or Christian. I'm not here to disprove Christianity. I'm merely going to be debating whether or not this is a wise reading of the text, and I think you'll see that after I'm done my presentation that this is a very bad idea for Catholicism to adopt this approach. And I will, of course, just also point out that this very topic, these verses were once discussed in the famous disputation between Nachmanides and Pablo Cristiani. If you have a head for history and religious debate, this is one of the all-time classics. So I'm no Nachmanides, and Gideon is no Pablo Cristiani, and he can decide for himself whether or not that is a compliment or a diss. But the other thing I want to acknowledge Rabbi Alexander Houle, who wrote a book called The Challenge of Jewish History, which did a lot of the effort and work for me in terms of assembling various sources I've developed and worked on top of what he's done, and also compiled my independent stuff. But it would be wrong of me to not acknowledge him and his work. I last want to just say my pedigree. I am not a historical scholar. I am not a religious scholar. I am just a normal Orthodox Jew who happens to really enjoy these topics and studies them deeply. So hopefully this will not be in vain for anybody, but just not claiming any degree of specialty. But hopefully the strength of my arguments will stand for themselves. And lastly, I want to thank and praise Kodesh Baruch Hu. Baruch. Let's get going. Okay, so framing the debate. As I said above, I'm not here to stop to argue against Christianity in general. I just hope that you guys will actually be persuaded by my arguments that you shouldn't be adopting this kind of approach to the book of Daniel. And I'm just going to give like a typology, which I think is really important. There's a Vilna Gaon on Proverbs who kind of bifurcates, the faithful into two types: people who need to like plan and rationalists, and people who are just like much more faith-based. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. The rationalists, of course, can accept the supernatural, but they have to reconcile their faith with cosmology, archaeology, history, linguistics, all of the different topics that kind of crop up and challenge the modern faithful. Faithful believers, however, they have they don't need these intellectual exercises necessarily. It's just enough for them to believe. I think both typologies are valid in their own right, but this audience is probably more in the faithfulist, rationalist category. If you're a follower of Gideon, he seems to be a person who's very devoted to the intellectual component, making things make sense. So I'm really here for you. I'm here to help ground your beliefs with more rigor, and the integrity of the prophets, I think, has primacy over tantalizing proofs, as we will see shortly. And last but not least, I just want to say something about biblical archaeology, because we're about to get into it pretty heavy. Gideon already touched on it to some degree with the discussion of the conventional chronology. This is not my specialty either, but I do hail from a scientific background, and I do see that this is a kind of a speculative academic field, but it does have evidence, and you have to deal with it, and you have to reconcile it. You can't not engage with it, and it's not the Bible is it's a semi-historical document. It lives in history, but it also does not necessarily feel bound to adhere closely to the modern standards of history, and so we have a very difficult task before us of trying to understand and unpack it. None of the archaeological arguments that should be conclusive, but we're going to spend that, and that's why we're going to motivate a lot of what I'm going to be saying. So you guys should, even if you don't agree with me or agree with all of the archaeological arguments that are going to be presented, you should still be motivated to accept what I'm saying, just because otherwise you're going to land in very hot water when it comes to how to understand Daniel in general, and the book of Daniel. And last but not least, I just want to point out that religious hypocrisy, I'm guilty of this myself. Other people are guilty of this, but we can just kind of acknowledge it and unpack it. Is that we are often, we have our preconceived beliefs, and we like to, we like to accept archaeological evidence when it supports what we already believe, but we'll often be critical of it as soon as it deviates from anything that we expect. Okay. So this is the main structure of the argument. First is I'm going to go through a Jewish read of Daniel 23 to 27. I'm going to explain exactly how we understand it and why I feel no reason to accept the Christian read, and I'll point out all the issues that I think would prevent us from ever learning like the Christians. Then I'm going to provide some motivations for why you Christians and Catholics more specifically should be rejecting any reading which requires adopting the conventional chronology that Gideon laid out. And then I'm going to be presenting evidence and arguments which favor the Seder Olam chronology over the conventional chronology. Seder Olam is the traditional Jewish chronology, as I'll explain to you kind of like the highlights of it very shortly, but it's basically going to we'll get into it and you'll understand. Okay, so let's start off with a textual analysis, but let's kind of ground it in, like, I created this, I see that the formatting has gotten a little bit wonky, but okay, that's not so bad. Basically, the idea of the Seder Olam is as follows, right? In the year 440 BCE, this is different from the conventional chronology that Gideon presented before, and I'll explain to you how exactly these discrepancies arise. But that was the very first 70 years that was prophesied by Jeremiah is talking about 7 years of Babylonian rule, and that happens in the fall of Nineveh. Babylon takes over, Israel starts paying fealty to them, and then subsequent to that, 18 years later, there is the destruction of the first temple that happened from Nebuchadnezzar. They're exiled to Babylon, and that kicks off a second separate year, 70 years of exile/desolation. And as a result, when we get to chapter 9 in Daniel, we are, Daniel is now faced with a crisis for multiple reasons, partially due to what, as Gideon had described in previous visions that he had seen, particularly in chapter 8, which is going to be very relevant for us. He is very concerned that the 70 years that Jeremiah had predicted are not actually going to be coming to pass. And so he gets clarification. Ultimately, that 70 years, though, is explained to be not the first 70 years of the fall of Nineveh, but rather the second 70 years from the period of exile. That's when the decree to rebuild and reconstruct the second temple is renewed after it's delayed, as in the first couple of chapters in Ezra. You can read about those if you want to. And ultimately ultimately he's disclosed the 70 weeks. But for us, the 70 weeks is 7 weeks plus 62 weeks, 7 weeks which have basically already come to pass, and the 62 weeks which are still yet to come, and the 7 weeks gets 3 extra days, and the 62 weeks gets 4 extra days, so it's 70 weeks all in. And that's going to take us all the way up to the end of the destruction of the second temple. Okay. All right. So the translation I'm using here is is just from the JPS. I've modified a couple words. Everything I've modified in red is it's just minor changes I've made, and yellow are the things that I've highlighted that I think are of interest. I'm noticing the time, so I'm just going to kind of speed along right into each individual passage. So, okay, so a word went forth as you began your plea, and I have come to tell you, and for you are precious, to mark the word and understand the vision. So I'm starting one verse earlier than when we started, because this is very important, and this is going to be a question I'm going to ask. I see the Hebrew is not rendering very well in StreamYard. That's okay. It's this word mare, to understand the vision. What vision is that referring to? This is a question I would pose to Gideon, but I think the straightforward answer that Rashi understands later, as we'll see in 926, is that this is referring, of course, to what's going on in chapter 8, the vision that he has with the animals, and we'll see, and the explanation that he got therein. All right, let's keep moving on. So yes, okay, so the second pasuk. So 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to fill the measure of transgression, and that sin and iniquity is atoned, and the eternal righteousness ushered in, the prophetic vision ratified, and the Holy of Holies anointed. Right. So we understand the Holy of Holies is just you had pointed out that Holy Holies could be referring to Yom Kippur, I think. It does get that appellation in Vayikra, but also the more standard understanding, of course, is that we're talking about the temple, that this is the third temple, right? So there's going to be 70 weeks on which the Jews have an extended period of a second temple period, but that's ultimately going to come to a close. That is going to then be followed by the long end of days, in which we're in a long exile, and then ultimately renewed in this Holy of Holies. That is going to be the third temple. And then now, this is pasuk 25 is where we kind of start getting into the important things. So Gideon argued, of course, Mashiach Nagid, of course, that's referring to Jesus. But the question is, if you look in verse 25 and 26, it really changes. There's the Mashiach Nagid, which means the leader, as he translated it, and then it loses this appellation Nagid. Why did it lose the appellation Nagid? Or did this title Nagid, leader, ever really apply to Jesus? Because Nagid really doesn't just mean a leader. It means state power. It means somebody who has power, which is why we understand Mashiach Nagid to be referring to Kurash. He's the person who's coming at the end of the 7 weeks, and he's the one who's going to be announcing that we're allowed to rebuild Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is inclusive of everything, of course. It wasn't Cyrus, as we know, gave us the ability. Ezra told us he gave us the ability to build Yerushalayim and build the Beit Hamikdash, and ultimately. Okay, so the emphasis is on the Beit Hamikdash, right, in the verses, but of course the surrounding city you would also be rebuilding, in tandem. It's not like you're not going to get to build the building and the society without building the Beit Hamikdash. I think that's just straightforward. And the Shiva, and this is the 7 weeks. Now, interestingly, he pointed out that I congratulate Gideon for knowing about the Asnachtha. Yes, the Asnachtha divides the verse. Now you can say, oh, those scribes didn't know any better, but let's be real for a second. Like, the verse divides it. Why 7 weeks and 62 weeks? You say, oh, well, it's the Talmud Jubilee. First of all, a Jubilee is not 49 years. A Jubilee is 50 years. But you can look that up in Leviticus 25:10. There's no reason to associate. But then you can ask the question, why? Why are we being told about a Yovel year? Why are we talking about a Jubilee year at all? Like, what relevance does it have here? Well, it has relevance because it happens to be dividing the period that we've just ending, in which Cyrus is, is here now, like the Babylonians are over, and in comes this new period, and then we're going to get the rest of the 62 weeks. So it just, it's not very compelling why it should be divided up. The reference that you made to Ezekiel also doesn't really make sense, because that you fail to disclose to the audience that that verse also is defining a unit. And why is it 25 shekels, 20 and 15? I think it's not to tell you 25, 15, and 20 is because those were individual units themselves. Those were classic units, and they were all coming up to a super unit. This Evan, I believe, I forget the exact language is used in the verse, but it's defining a unit. It's not just like, you can't just decompose things at will. And even if you did, you always have to explain why. Like, why would the verse do this? Why would it decompose it? So there's a very compelling reason from the Jewish perspective. There's no really compelling reason, like why, like what emphasis possibly could we have to like emphasize the Yovel, and why not just all the Yovels then? And it's not even the Yovel, as I pointed out, 490. It has to be 50 years. It can't be 49. The seven sets of 7, and the Yovel year is the 50th year from the 49th. So it doesn't make any sense to describe this as the Yovel year, not from the Torah and not in this context. Okay, keep going. So, after the 62 years, Yikaris Mashiach ve'ein lo, ve'ir ve'kodesh, yashches, nagid. Right now, we get to see that term nagid has been divorced from Mashiach. Why? Because power has been divorced from this person, the Mashiach. So it didn't make sense to refer to, Jesus never had state power. And now, if these two people were the same people, then like, why is the term, differentiated? It doesn't stand to reason. Now, I thought it was interesting that Yikaris, you translated it, I think, correctly, which is like cut away. Right now, it's interesting. There's a whole problem here because there's a Rashi over here, which does actually say that is talking about Neharag. It means that he's killed. But we don't actually have Rashi was validated by the Ramban, who said that he's based on a Chazal, but it doesn't really stand to reason if you look at Josephus. Unfortunately, I wouldn't normally go against Rashi, especially not in the context where people don't really understand that Rashi is preeminent among scholars, and that's not something you just easily just eschew, but it's very difficult to understand Rashi because he says it's Agrippus. Agrippus the first died in 45 CE. Seems like he was killed by an act of God, according to Josephus, and Agrippus the second died much later in 93. But neither of those readings necessarily, I think, is as strong as the Ralbag's reading, which of course he says Yikaris doesn't, it just means cut off. We're just talking about an anointed one that lost its power. Now, there's a couple ways that you could take that. Now, he's referring specifically to the Goyen Gadol, the high priest, and that would make sense. At the end of the 62 weeks, there you go. Yikaris Mashiach. The end of the 62 weeks is when the temple is destroyed, not 40 years earlier, when Jesus dies. Like 62 years is when all these things happen simultaneously. Yikaris Mashiach, ve'ir ve'kodesh. They happen at the same time after the 62 weeks. Everybody acknowledges that Jesus died 40 years before the end of the, so like before the destruction of the temple. So there's no way to read this verse that you can't put these time together. And the Ein Lo, I think, also is very very telling that we can't be talking about Jesus because the Ein Lo, he's gone. Like, I mean, wasn't he resurrected according to the Christians? So again, so Mashiach Nagid, now Mashiach is divorced from Nagid, and you can't combine these words. It was never referring to Jesus in the first place, and it's certainly not referring to him now in this place. Okay, and then I'm actually going to just move over this last slide because I'm kind of running short on time, and I want to get to the motivations for why you guys should be rejecting the conventional chronology, because this is really important. So important thing is to understand the conventional chronology and the difference between the Siddur and chronology, because people make this mistake, they get it wrong, and we need to understand. So the conventional chronology, as Gideon has stipulated, is an extended Persian period in which there's approximately 11 emperors, depending on how you count it up, that end in the year 331 BCE when Alexander the Great defeats Darius III. According to the Siddur Olam chronology, however, Alexander the Great is defeated by Darius I. And this happened in 317 BCE. And people would say, oh, well, how can you possibly stand up against all this evidence? Obviously, we see that there was an extended Persian period. It's not our contention that there was never an extended Persian period at all, just that the relative all the documents which Gideon referenced, all we really ever know about them is their relative place in history based on king years. We don't actually know their precise placement, although actually I will contest that point. I think we do actually precisely know, and we know that it's the Seder Olam, as I will present evidence at the end of my talk. So let's keep moving along right here. So So this is the Ptolemy's canon that he was referring to, and if you adopt this this canon, I mean, if you adopt this perspective, you're going to immediately run into some serious problems. But just the lines of evidence, we have Ptolemy's canons, we have Herodotus, we have Thucydides, we have Xenophon, we have Aeschylus' plays, Plato, Aristotle had referred to these people. So we know that there existed this extended Persian period. These are all the various lines of evidence that are pointed to. I'm just listing them out here. I want to emphasize these Elephantine papyri that were discovered that I'm actually going to be using to demonstrate the exact opposite. The astronomical text that you referenced and the Manetho, all of that. Okay, but why should you guys reject this conventional chronology? Well, it undermines Daniel's prophetic legitimacy altogether, right? I mean, and Gideon has to acknowledge, right, that this is extremely problematic, because Daniel himself is the one who says that there are only 3 Persian kings before Alexander the Great comes and beats, right? According to the conventional chronology, he's beating Darius III, the 11th empire. But if you look in Daniel chapter 8, verses 3 to 5, there's going to be 3 Persian kings, and then the Greeks are going to conquer them. It's a colorful episode with the ram versus the goats, and but it's even explained. The angel comes and explains later on in Pasuk 20 to 21. He says, no, this is the Greek kingdom coming to beat the Persians. So it must be. Daniel himself does not hold of the conventional chronology. And if you suggest that Ezra is happening in Arxes, 456, or that this is somehow happening in in some later period in the conventional chronology in order to make it work with the Jesus timeline, that is to say the 490 years must be going from the conventional chronology, well, that contradicts Daniel, and you totally undermined him as legitimacy of a prophet. I would go so far to say that maybe this would be considered some type of heresy, because you're saying that he's a totally errant prophet. He is unable to make predictions. Not only does he make it in chapter 8, but he also makes it in chapter 11 as well. The same exact thing. He says there are 3 more kings of Persia, warrior kings from the Greeks are going to come and conquer them. You're in serious hot water in trying to jerry-rig chapter 9 to be talking about Jesus. You undermine, you unpin so many different things. In fact, there's far worse things that happen too, right? Like Ezra. Like, how old is Ezra at the time of this meeting with Artaxerxes, which you're identifying as Artaxerxes? Well, we know his father Tzariah was killed at the time of the destruction of the first temple. Now let's be very charitable. 70 years of the Babylonian exile, 9 years for Cyrus according to Ptolemy's canon, 8 years for Cambyses, 36 years for Darius, 21 years for Xerxes. He's already 144 and that's not even in the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign, right? So we're talking about somebody with extreme longevity. And if you go with Maimonides' understanding, he actually has to end up being 220 years old, according to the conventional chronology, in order for him to be the predecessor to Shimon HaTzadik, who becomes the high priest who you referenced in your Gemara and Yuma in 39. Right now, if we go with the conventional chronology, you're also going to have to be like 136 years old. I'm running short on time, so I'm just going to be running through these guys because I really want to get to the evidence and compelling.
I'm okay with letting you run over a bit if you want to finish this.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm gonna go fast though. I really apologize because I do see that I'm going a little bit over time. Major figures: Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, the Zugot, all these pairs. These people would all have the major transmission of the Torah in these 5 generations that we have listed out. They would all have to reign for 80 plus years in order to satisfy the conventional chronology. Now, I recognize obviously there's a lot of compelling evidence of the conventional chronology, but we're about to see some reasons to reject it and actually suggest the Seder Olam chronology over the conventional chronology, which most people are unaware of. And this was because it's totally untenable for us to embrace this as Christians and as Jews to say that the conventional chronology is correct. We simply can't do it. There were people who did not have this kind of longevity, in these times, in this era of biblical history. Okay, so what are the evidence? So I'm going to point out to the Order King list, the Alexander Chronicle, cuneiform text in BM 36613. That's the British Museum, and this is the Iraq Museum, the IM at BM, in case you're wondering. I'm going to do a meta-analysis on the intercalary dates between Darius I and II, and then we're going to finish off with the interval analysis of the Elephantine papyri that I mentioned in the beginning. So first thing we're going to just notice here. Okay, this is the Order King list. This is this is my big knock to the Ptolemy's canon, right? We see that Nidin Bel is right above Darius I, and then right below that is Alexander the Great. in this document. How could that possibly be? Nindumbel, of course, right? You guys know from the Bitsuin inscription, he was one of the people that tried to usurp the throne from Darius. This has to be talking about Darius first, not talking about Darius III. There's no other person to read it. Now it's knocked off. It says 5 years. Of course, we know 35 years, but you can't really see it scratched out, unfortunately. So we can't. I don't have perfect proof that we're talking, of course, about Darius, 35, 36 years, depending on how you look at things. Next thing, the Alexander Chronicle. This is also one where it's like this discusses the views of Darius, the King of Kings, by Alexander. Now Darius III would never have gotten the appellation King of Kings, as we're going to see. Like it was a very limited and weak empire at the point of Darius III. Furthermore, Alexander is not even referred to as a king here, which suggests that he's in his come up. And not only that, it talks about the festival of Bel. The Bel was a Babylonian god. He was a Babylonian idol. If it was Darius III, that we're talking about an idol which hadn't been relevant for 200 years. Why would that be relevant in this particular time period when Darius when Alexander is fighting Darius? It wouldn't be relevant, but it would be if it was Darius I. Furthermore, we have also another text which Arces is, who is called Artasasta. He is walking around, and Temple and Alexander, they're mourning. Well, how can that be? Now, the conventional chronology obviously is aware of this, and they try to deal with it. They say, oh, well, it could be maybe they have. They try and make some very charitable connections, but it's very difficult. Because I'm running so short on time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because the most compelling evidence is to come. Okay, so the meta-analysis that we've done, actually, so all these kings, they lasted a very long time, as we saw from Darius I down to Darius II. They all had long reigns, more than 19 years. And if you know anything about the Babylonian calendar that was adopted by the Persians, adopted by the Jews, I mean, the Jews also, we would say that we had the calendar forever, but okay, fine. We're all using the same calendar. It's a 19-year cycle. That's a lunar solar calendar where they insert a month every so often in order to make sure that every 19 years you're back in line with the solar calendar. So you can actually look at all the documents that Gideon had alluded to, and you can see when you see these leap months being added into each of these years, and you can reconstruct where they are in the 19-year cycle. And you can see Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Darius. You can see exactly where they are in these cycles. And when you do that analysis, which you guys can pause the screen afterwards and just look for this yourself, you're going to see that Xerxes actually was 3 years out from Darius' end. It wasn't a transition from Darius straight to Xerxes. Why is that? Like, there's a 3-year gap, almost like the empire came to a standstill, almost like Darius was destroyed and the Persian Empire was only restarted a couple years later because it was conquered by the Greeks, or partially, right? This is, and by the way, where's Ptolemy's canon in this? Why does it not mention the fact that there was a 3-year gap? There's clearly a 3-year gap if you just do this analysis. There's no getting around it, and yet it suggests that it's continuous. Okay, last, look at not last, but getting close to the end. Babylonian cuneiform metadata, right? So we have all these documents which you would reference, Gideon, and if you look at the number of documents by monarch over their entire year of reign, and then you normalize it relative to the number of texts per year, you see something dramatic happen between Darius and Xerxes, right? We're at like 60-some documents per year, and then it drops by like 90%. Why does it drop by 90%? What happened to the empire? Darius was Darius the Great. He led the greatest, he led the Achaemenids to their absolute heights. Why are they being demolished, and why are we going down to like 90% drop in it boggles the mind, unless of course you understand that this was a huge blow to the empire and they never really recovered from it after that, and they became a much smaller kingdom living side by side with the Greeks. Now you're going to say, wow, Jordan, where's the evidence? Okay, Tractatus, where's the evidence that you're going to see that somehow there's two empires living next to each other? Well, we have lots of documents in various places. There's lacuna of Greek documents in Persian areas and a lacuna of Persian documents in Greek areas, right? In contrast, like in Persia, we see like the Seleucids should have taken over, and we should see lots of evidence of the Seleucids. Where are the Seleucids in Persia? We had 30,000 texts that we discovered in Persepolis. Where's all the evidence of the Seleucids? We don't find any. In the contrast with Babylon, where is it? There's much evidence of the Seleucid rule there, and we see lots of documents in there. Likewise, in Egypt, there's a geographical divide where you see the presence of the Persians versus you seeing the presence of the Greeks. And all of this is to suggest that these two empires were actually living side by side next to each other. Now, this is all evidence which I think is relatively compelling, but the very last piece of evidence that I'm going to bring you, I think it's just a super awesome knockout. But it requires a little bit of explanation. I apologize for going so much over, but I think everybody's going to be super rewarded by studying this. Okay, so in Elephantine, which is an island off of Egypt, there was a Jewish community that lived there. They there was an amazing discovery of 20 legal contracts that were basically dated from the time of Xerxes all the way down to Darius II. And so in those documents, they were double dated with the Egyptian dates and Babylonian dates. And then why is this so important? Because the Egyptian dates is a solar calendar. And so the interval between any two dates is always going to be a fixed amount. Whereas the Babylonian calendar, well, it depends on the year. As we just said, it's a lunar solar cycle. So whatever year you land on, it's going to have a different interval between the two documents. So the question will be, well, wait a second, since we know the king year and we can plug in any given Julian calendar year and see how good of an interval match do we get between the Babylonian dates and the Egyptian dates, right? Because if you're a good sofer, if you're a good scribe, you're going to write the same date that's in the Egyptian date as is in the Babylonian date. Now, one little tweak I'm going to mention before we go further, which is that, of course, the Babylonian calendar starts the day at the nighttime and the Egyptian calendar starts the day at the daytime. So you can occasionally expect to see that there's going to be a discrepancy if people were writing a legal contract at night, which happens throughout the year because, sometimes the sunset is much earlier in the day and people still do business at nighttime. But you wouldn't expect to see too many of them. Well, what happens when you plug in the conventional chronology date for Xerxes? Well, you get a surprisingly strange result. You get a couple of 2-day misses, which is really bizarre. Was the scribe drunk? That's a little crazy. And you also get a bunch of days where it was off by more than there were 9 some documents that there was a difference by a day, right? And there were only 7 matches. Not bad, but not great. What happens if you do it under the Seder Olam chronology? Whoa, 15 matches and 3 B1s. That is to say the Babylonian date was ahead by 1 day, which we can understand because it was nighttime. That is so much better. That's an incredible result. Not only that, they did an analysis. Alex Poole did an analysis. We're using, how did they reconstruct this? Of course, there was a sophisticated program developed at Harvard using all the Babylonian calendar texts, which were mentioned, and they brought this count, they performed this calculation on 50 different calendar years of Julian's War. And the Seder Olam chronology beat every single one of them. By far. And I turned that around. I turned that into a score. I said, okay, you get 2 points for a match, 1 point for a B1, and you get a penalty if it's negative 2 days, which actually was favorable to some of these things because they had 3-day discrepancies for a bunch of these different years. And when you create such a score, the Seder Olam has the highest score by far out of any of these. And oh my gosh, the slides are totally wacky. I'm surprised that anybody can see this.
Hey, how much longer do you have? Because we're kind of.
That's it. Oh yeah, I'm so sorry. Okay, we're basically done. Seder Olam chronology totally knocks out the conventional chronology. Conclusions: what we've demonstrated, Jewish read is highly competitive, compelling. You have established motivation for why Christians should also want to reject a conventional chronology approach, and the Seder Olam chronology I think is much better. I apologize for going over time. I am now done. I am so sorry. Okay.
No problem. Gideon, we've got 15 for rebuttal on our agreement, but since we went a little over, I would just say kind of take the time you need to hit the points you want to hit.
All right, yeah. So thank you, Tractatus, for that opening statement, and I didn't mind you going over. So I'd rather we actually have a good discussion than we stick very closely to the times exactly. So that was no issue at all. So I'll first start with dealing with the Seder Olam issues, and then I'll deal with the reading. Because I really feel like the Seder Olam chronology is really at the heart of the issues that the Jewish reading faces. And so first of all, does accepting the conventional chronology mean you think Daniel has to be wrong? And no, it's because Daniel uses prophetic language where he's often going to skip over times and events and so on. So as an example of this, if we look in Daniel 11, right, and we follow through all of Daniel 11 very closely, all the way up until verse 35, you can match events that are going on in the text very, very closely to individual marriages that are going on between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and all sorts of other little details. This is actually what causes secular scholars to think that Daniel is a forgery, because his prophecies of this period are so incredibly accurate that they think he couldn't but be a forger. Until we get to the end of verse 35, because then when we go to verse 36, there's no obvious next event that matches it. So this has actually led to lots of debate, even among Jewish and Christian scholars. There's not agreement among Jews, there's not agreement among Christians on what the last set of verses in Daniel means. Now, I tend to think if we go on, especially it's at verse 40 where it starts to get very difficult. Now, I do think that there is a plausible reading of this at the end of the 1st century BC, and if you'd like to, we could get into that, but I don't think that's too important here. The point is that no matter what interpretation you take, everyone thinks that somewhere in between verse 35 and verse 40, there is a gap of at least a century. And many people think there's a gap of millennia that's going on here. So everyone agrees that Daniel can be giving a very close reading of time and then skip over lots of time and then go back to a close reading of time and so on, because he's trying to highlight events that are important for prophecy. So we have 3 Persian kings. Then Persia gets involved in dealing with Greece. So Darius fights 2 wars with Greece. And then at that point, that's when everything kicks off with Persia's involvement with Greece, which will ultimately eventually lead to Alexander going over in revenge for the Greco-Persian Wars to go conquer Persia. So it's ultimately when Persia starts getting involved in Greece and stirs up trouble in Greece, that's sort of when Persia dooms themselves to eventually be conquered by the Greeks. But there's a bigger issue here, right? So the Seder Olam, it shortened conventional chronology by about 165 years. But the main way it does this is by shortening Persian history. And I mean, pre-Alexander Persian history. I'm glad he cited Rav Hul on this. Unfortunately, I was not able to get Rav Hul's book because it's out of print. But I found a talk by him, so I was able to get a summary of his essential arguments. And so Persian time before Alexander is shortened from 270 years to 53 years, which is a 154-year difference in pre-Alexander Persian history. And this requires basically moving 9 Persian kings and 2 regions to after the time of Alexander. But the main problem here is not what you're going to do to Persian history. I mean, it doesn't work with Persian history either, but the main issue is what it does to classical Greek history. So the first Greco-Persian War occurred during the reign of Darius I. And Darius the first rebuilt the temple in the 6th year of Ezra, and he had then 34 more years of his reign before Alexander conquers the empire, according to the Seder Olam. And then maybe you could also get 9 more years, let's say, to the time of Alexander's death. So let's say, for example, you get 49 years here. New things. But the issue is that we have huge amounts of Greek documents that cannot be compressed into this 49-year period. And just as one small example is Thucydides and Xenophon. So Thucydides writes the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, and then Xenophon writes a sequel to it called the Hellenica. So together, these works provide a year-by-year chronology of 69 years of Greek history. So already, if you want to say, let's say, for example, the first 2 Greco-Persian wars, or really all 3 Greco-Persian wars, never even happened. That right away, as soon as Darius comes to the throne, immediately the events in Thucydides go off, right? Immediately the Peloponnesian Wars start. I don't know where all the Greco-Persian Wars happen, but let's say that happens, right? Already then you have 69 years. Then you also have to remove all the events between the end of the Hellenica, so the entire rise of Philip II in Macedon, and Alexander's rise, and so on. You have to compress, get rid of all of that as well. You already have 20 years too many here to be able to fit things in. So even if our conventional chronology was wrong, it cannot be that the Seder Olam chronology is correct. It just directly contradicts contemporary records that we have from Greece and really from Greece. But then we can also bring in all the other records as well. I can't go through all the evidences that Tractatus brought up about documents and so on. But I will point out that I think the Babylonian idols point is really not relevant because Babylonian religion just continued as it was. There was multiple revolts of Babylon during this time. So we go through Parker and Duberstein. Unfortunately, I accidentally mistyped his name as Dublin. My initial thing, but Duberstein. If you go through him, you can see all the various tablets he lists of when there were times that there were revolts. Also, if you, let's say, for example, Hul is correct, how do the Greco-Persian Wars happen? Because we know, right, Tractatus agreed that when Herodotus is talking about Xerxes, he's talking about the Xerxes that comes after Darius I. So does Xerxes just march his army through the Seleucid Empire to go fight a war with Greece? Like, how does this happen? He also, at the beginning of his reign, we have documents in Egypt that he put down a revolt in Egypt. Did he just march through the Seleucid Empire, marched into the Ptolemaic Empire, and put down a revolt of lands he didn't control anyways? So it doesn't matter if there's more documents in one place, less documents in another. How many documents are preserved has to do with all sorts of historical factors, climate, and so on. What matters is that you shouldn't find a single document like this that we do, but we find dozens of such documents that just blatantly contradict the Seder Olam chronology. And then also, if Xerxes fights a war with Herodotus, do the Greeks later on mix up the order of the Greco-Persian wars and the rise of Alexander? Like, none of these details make any sense at all. All right, now getting to the issue of the reading of Daniel here. So first of all, I want to agree very much with what Tractatus said about religious hypocrisy, that we need to accept all the evidence, whether or not it is going to be favorable towards us or not. We can't just reject it because it doesn't fit necessarily with our view, and we're very inclined to do that. So I agree there. So he goes back one verse earlier to 9:23 and asks, what is this vision? I don't have any strong opinions on what he's specifically referring to, but I'm totally fine if that's Daniel 8. But the whole point is Daniel 8 gives us the events of the various kingdoms that are going to rise and fall during this period. And so this is just telling us what's going to happen during the 490 years. So that's really not disputed at all between us. I don't see how that has any issue with what I've said in my position. All right. Then we have the question of, is Jesus a Nagid? So yes, he is, because the whole point of the Messiah is that he is a king. So, and really, if we look at the whole point of the Messiah is going to be this great king who's going to rule over all the nations. So even though Jesus didn't have political authority during his earthly ministry, the whole point is that he's now king over all of the nations. And so I don't see how that's an issue at all. So, yes, why emphasize the Jubilee? So he first points out that the Jubilee is 50. This is actually a dispute that we see among scholars, both in the ancient world, it's recorded as a debate in the Talmud, and is, again, still a debate among scholars now, of whether the Jubilee was 49 years or 50 years. So it could very well have been 49 years. And fortunately, I didn't take a note on this, but I am pretty sure the Book of Jubilees records it as 49 years. So it seems the more ancient position that we have records for is it being simply 49 years. And so then Tractatus brings up the point, and it's a very good point, of we have to give a good reason that the years are divided up. So Ezekiel breaks it up into standard measurements and say, hey, you combine these standard measurements and you get this measurement of 60, which is another measurement. But here, again, as I pointed out, we have a measurement. It's trying to divide off the Jubilee. And why would it bring in the Jubilee? Well, the whole point of the Jubilee is it was the year that everyone was freed from their debts. And the Christian understanding of the purpose of the Messiah is to free us from sin. So Jesus frees us from our real debt, our debt to sin, which is a much deeper level than freeing us from our monetary debt. And likewise, what also happens in the Jubilee is everyone gets to return to their ancestral lands. So it's a return from exile, which again, the Messiah, this is agreed by Jews and Christians, that the Messiah brings us back from exile. And so all the various themes of the Jubilee, they're all about what the Messiah is supposed to do. They're a symbol to point forward to the Messiah. Then we have the issue of being cut off versus killed in the translation of Ve'ein Lo. So in terms of the translation of Ve'ein Lo, I agree this is a very difficult thing to translate. It's just simply not clear what it means. But not for himself is a perfectly fine translation of it. We can get maybe into the translation of that, because it's a very difficult word to translate there. And then the issue of being cut away versus killed. Again, even if you want to take it as accursed, the whole theme in the book of Galatians is that Jesus has taken the curse of the law upon himself. So in a sense, if it means to be accursed rather than to be physically killed, that would fit just as well with the Christian view. All right. Then we have the issue as well for the Seder Olam. I forgot to discuss this earlier. Is the issue of that Ezra would simply be too old But again, this assumes the later understanding of the handing down of the Torah from generation to generation. Now, look, I simply don't see Maimonides as like the be all end all of how we're going to take the passing down of the Torah. I mean, he is a full millennium after these events we're talking about. I mean, Maimonides is closer in time to us than he is to Ezra. So I don't see how he's necessarily a better source. Anyone else would be. All right, and then we have the issue also of, can the events of the temple, destruction of the temple, occur after the 70 weeks are fully complete? Right? Can they occur separately from the other things? And I do understand why on a first reading it would seem like it should all occur together. But strictly speaking, nothing in the verse says that it has to occur during that exact 70 weeks. It just says it's going to occur after the 62 weeks, which everyone agrees. And it should have some relevance to the 70 weeks. But again, it does have some relevance that Jesus understood the coming destruction of the temple as a sign or as a punishment for Jerusalem's rejection of him. All right, I also want to point out with the Jubilee as well, if you look in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls really do understand the Jubilee in this messianic way. So it seems perfectly reasonable that at the time of Jesus, Jews would have been reading these passages in the way I'm saying, right? You have a huge messianic fervor in the first century. Like Josephus records many other messiahs that are coming about at around the same time. And likewise, you also have, shortly after the destruction of the temple, Bar Kokhba coming about, right, as another attempted Messiah. So everyone seemed to think this was going to happen soon. Right? There was clear prophecies. All right, there was going to be this first 70-year exile. But you don't see anywhere in the prophets there's another 2,000-year exile. The Messiah is supposed to come in conjunction with these 70 weeks, not 2,000 years after the 70 weeks are complete. And even Rashi sees these weeks are about the coming of the Messiah. And then he has to insert an unmentioned 2,000-year gap at the very end of the passage. All right, and that's everything I have for my rebuttal here.
All right, Tractatus, when you're ready, go ahead and start your 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, I'll try and cut down this time around so as to make up for the fact that I went so long in the opening. So I think it's interesting how Gideon is kind of like ducking and fainting. That in Daniel 11, where he mentioned how precise everything was, to such a degree that, yes, this is precisely why the scholars point out and say, oh, it must be that, that Daniel is written much later, but then is willing to say, well, he must have been really vague at the point where the three kings, except that in 11:2, it's very, like the text is telling you explicitly that he is, that there's three more Persian kings, and that is going to be tackled by the Greek king, right? So like this is, and then that Greek king, his empire is going to split into four. It's so clear that it's Alexander, and yet we're saying no. Why? Only because we're so motivated to try and make chapter 9 work, right? Except that that's clearly undermining the very simple, straightforward read of chapter 11, of chapter 8. There's no way around it. Like there's the Seder Olam is closely hewing its text to Daniel. It clearly understands that the three Persian kings are there, and trying to say, well, he was being vague at that point. Well, wait, so he's being vague in chapters 8 and 11. Oh, but for chapter 9, which is at 23 to 27, where it's actually much more unclear. The verses are much more difficult to parse, as we both struggle to give a simple, straightforward read to those verses. Well, those, we know for sure that it's talking about Jesus. Well, so how is it that, like in verses 11:2, when it's so clear and obvious that they don't, well, that must be, because we have to accept the conventional chronology, in order to make chapter 9 work for Jesus. It just seems like it's a highly motivated, just so reading of the text. Now, now this is an interesting. Okay, so the 49 years in Jubilee non-canon. I just wanted to point out that, like, citing the Book of Jubilee, I don't believe that. You can interrupt and tell me if I'm wrong here, but I don't even think the Catholic Church has canonized that work. So I don't even know why we're discussing that as as a relevant source. I think that the Greek Orthodox or the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has like canonized it, and that's like the only one. But maybe I'm wrong there. You feel free to interrupt and tell me if I'm wrong.
You're correct there. I was just citing it
Okay.
as a historical example of what people in the past done.
Okay, very good. Okay, so now I just want to jump back more into chapter 9, the verses again. When you pointed out the Mashiach Nagid, why does it change? The one has to ask, why does it change? Mashiach Nagid originally, but then he's no longer Nagid. So you want to say, well, Jesus he was king of the world. Well, first of all, where was his state power? And then clearly in the next verse, Nagid is being used to refer Nagid. It is using state power. That's Titus, the Romans coming in, knocking out the Jews in the war, and there it's being used. And so we'd have to change the understanding of how that term Nagid is being used from one verse to the very next, when it's very clearly being departed. It's first being used in expression. Why? Because that was Kurash, that was Cyrus. He was at the end of the 7 weeks that was coming, and he was Mashiach, like we saw in the verse in Isaiah, and he is also a Nagid because he had power, as that same verse in Isaiah says. It was the Chazek. He was strengthened. He was a person who had the ability to make decrees, and everybody had to listen because he was the big boss. He was the emperor. But the Mashiach character that's being referred to, like, even if you want to say like Rashi, who has his problems, as we pointed out before, like Agrippa, he was a king that lacked state power. He was just a client king to the Roman Empire. Or if you want to say that he was the Kohen Gadol, like the Ralbag, then he is not a person with state power. Who had the state power was Titus, was the people coming and knocking in. So I think that's, like, again, tighter read. I'm not saying that you can't read it the way that you want to, but I, as a Jew, don't have a compelling reason to accept what you're saying over what I'm saying, because I think the question's stronger than your answer. So even if you're saying something and maybe you could screw it up, it could be, but I'm not moved as a Jew. Like, there's no compelling reason for me to go and say like that you're correct in this situation over my own read, which I think is closer to the text. And as I pointed out, Yikaris does not say kill. It means it's somebody who's getting cut off. So he's not the person, the Mashiach here that's getting cut off doesn't even necessarily have to die whatsoever. The Maimonides point, yes, that's fine. You're not beholden to Maimonides, that's true, but that's why I brought the separate calculation of Ezra, who would have to be more than 150 years old if you just apply the conventional chronology. Again, his father died, Sariah dies at the end of in the destruction of the first temple. So he had to be at least 1 year old, when the year his father died, and of course that's being charitable, right? And then if you just count all the way out to Artaxerxes, as you wanted to suggest was the case, now I don't even think that person is Artaxerxes. The Artaxerxes, sorry, the verse is not actually that figure. The Seder Olam is very clear. I without diving too deeply into it, these are throne names that were being applied to the kings, much like Augustus and Caesar are applied to Roman empires and Roman emperors and people in their come up. And again, the 62 weeks that you mentioned, and this list, 62 weeks that you mentioned is yes, you're right. We don't have to learn them all happening at the same moment. But again, the simple, straightforward read is that they are happening at the same time. And why should we deviate from that? Why should we as Jews be compelled to accept a reading which moves us away from the simple reading of the text? There's no reason for us to do so. And as I pointed out, there's no reason for you as Christians to do so either, because you're going to be creating so many more problems textually. If you adopt the conventional chronology, we stuck to Daniel, but believe me, there are more problems that happen. Look at Ezekiel 29, Ezekiel 29, right? He is over there. There's 40 years of desolation described to Egypt. Good luck making that one make sense according to the conventional chronology. If you adopt the Seder Olam chronology, all right, you're cooking with some grease over there, because Cambyses is the one who comes back and restores the cities that would have been at the end of the 40 years. So okay, you got some good. Now you raised a very good question, right? And I want to acknowledge good questions, because I'm really not trying to sell everyone a bag of goods here. But yes, correct. If you adopt the Seder Olam chronology, this is going to require a significant re-understanding and reinterpretation of history as we know it. But that's why I brought compelling evidence to suggest that the Seder Olam is correct. How can you explain these documents? We don't actually know, right? We have the vast majority of the documents that you cited, they're all just relative chronology documents. We know that there is a string of kings. We know that there's a string of individuals, but where we place them in history is a matter that's a weak link in the chain, and that has much less evidence than was previously suggested. And yes, one has to understand, what is Herodotus talking about? What is Xenophon talking about? Those are fair questions, but those are also documents which it's not like we're like it's not like we have the original version of these documents, right? Like these things, like the earliest versions of the documents that we have are like much later in history, and it's much harder to know what was precisely happening at that time in history, which is why we have to appeal to these these kind of like more rigorous archaeological methods and statistical methods, which I was applying to and appealing to in order to show you, as Christians, you guys should want this to be the case, because if you don't, you've just undermined Daniel. And by waving your hands and saying, well, over here when he talked about it, it's not something that's going to stand up to a person who is trying to rationally understand and read Daniel. The Seder Olam is compelling, and we have lots of good, compelling evidence from the Elephantine Papyri to suggest that the Seder Olam is correct. So if you have compelling evidence to suggest the Seder Olam is correct, and you have some open questions regarding, how we make this fit and understand the rest of Greek Persian history, fine. That's the state of play in most of biblical archaeology, most of archaeology in general, is that there are lots of open questions. And that's not like a question. Those questions are not of such a degree of magnitude that should be like, forcing us away from a much more favorable interpretation of history, which enables us to read and not call our own prophets to be, false, or not false, but you're saying like, this part taken on literally, this isn't precise or anything like that. Like, you don't have to do that, and you shouldn't want to do that, because the text is very clear that Alexander was going after Darius I, and that his empire was getting split up into four, and reading Daniel any other way is just it's to basically to not read it at all, and just to insert fantasy. So that's kind of the crux of my argument. I'm going to try and cut it short here, because I was so long in the tooth in the first part. So yeah, okay, there we go.
All right, thank you. So we have 20 minutes each for cross-examination. The rules that we agreed to here would basically just be that the one asking the questions can either interrupt or move to the next question. They kind of going to run the show of this round. And I figure, Tractatus, since you are sort of the guest here, if you'd like to decide who's going to go first asking the questions,
yeah, Gideon can go first. You can ask questions, and I'll try to do my best to answer them.
All right, are you all ready with the clock?
Give me 1 second.
All right.
All right, whenever you're ready.
All right, I'm ready. All right, so before I start with my questions, I thought I should maybe address one exegetical point that Tractatus has brought up a number of times, which is, how do we interpret prophecy, right? Because he brought up the example of Ezekiel 29, of issue of Egypt, and there's also an issue with Tyre in Ezekiel. And I've never closely studied these issues, but I've heard skeptics raise them. So I will acknowledge there can be difficulties sometimes with interpreting prophecies. But I think we need to be careful in our methodology. And what I mean by that is, right, we have historical books in the Tanakh that give us history of what happened in a clear, literal sense. And so in those ones, I think we have to take on faith that those records are accurate. And we can use archaeology to help us maybe contextualize some details that are disputed. So for example, if you look in a current, like, standard chronology of Israelite and Judahite kings, you'll see the numbers are slightly different than older ones. And that's because whether we use ascension year or non-ascension year counting, you're going to get slightly different numbers. And those have, the majority opinion on those has shifted as we've tried to reconcile them with Assyrian records. But when we go to prophecy then, I think with prophecy, we have to be a lot more careful, because prophecy uses a mix of literal and metaphorical at the same time, and it's projecting into the future. So it's one thing to say, right, I've written down a chronology of what happened before, and I'm passing this down to the next generation. And it's another to say, here's things that are going to happen in the future. Because then when you say things are going to happen in the future, to a certain extent, then you have to judge that by what actually happens in the future, which is different than you've written down a record of what already occurred. So I think when we're looking at the fulfillment of prophecy in Daniel, we have to be a little bit careful to make sure that we are not basically misinterpreting the history to fit with what actually happened. We have to take into account the actual evidence. All right, so now I want to go to the questions here. So my first question for Tractatus is, if the chronology of the Seder Olam were false, do you think that would mean Judaism is false, or do you think Judaism can be reconciled with the standard chronology?
I don't think that that Judaism can be reconciled with the standard chronology for for multiple reasons. Many of them having to do with the lifetimes, like Ezra, as we just pointed out. According to the conventional chronology, he's 150 years old when he's having that interaction with Artaxerxes, which just begs credulity. That amongst all the other reasons I listed, it's impossible for us to not embrace Seder Olam. So I think we as Catholics and Jews and Christians in general need to be looking to make the Seder Olam, make the Torah work with the Seder Olam, and try to re-understand history in light of the Seder Olam.
Yeah. I'm curious, what makes you certain that it's the Sariah that was in the exile that is his father? Like, how do we know it's not two different Sariahs? This was a common name, from what I understand.
I mean, how many Sariahs are there in the Tanakh?
But I mean, right, if you have a name, right, we're now looking over the period of hundreds of years. There's a very good chance someone with the same name can occur twice in hundreds of years, even if it maybe isn't necessarily the most common name.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of our tradition that it's the same person. This was, this is the, this is part of Jewish tradition. Is there explicit, it says that he's the Ben Sariah. Is there any, you could say, well, who's to say that's the same one? Well, yeah, I mean, you could do that, with almost any character in the Torah. This is part of our tradition, of understanding. So it's, but there's, it's a point of fact that's part of the Jewish tradition.
Fair enough. Do you know when that tradition is first recorded?
Good question. I have to find it. I owe you that.
Okay. Yeah, because I would say, I think there is a lot of value in Jewish tradition, even for Christians, in understanding things. And our best exegetes have always engaged with the Jewish tradition and looking at things, but we don't regard it as divinely given in the same way that you do. And so for us, it can also be wrong as well, even though I think it can be very useful, and I think some people underrate the value of it. I don't necessarily think I'm bound to it if I think there are good reasons against it. So you mentioned how there are maybe some discrepancies with some issues, and I'd like to look into further the ones you mentioned. But it seems to me, all right, that there could be certain discrepancies, which, all right, some numbers are coming off, as you mentioned, right? It can easily be things could be 1 day off or even a year off, depending on how we calculate things. So, for example, there's a dispute of, did Ezra come in 458 BC or 457 BC, right? Because, all right, we know it's the 7th year of Artaxerxes. We know what year that is in the Persian calendar, but the Jewish calendar starts at a different time of year than the Persian calendar. So how were the Jews counting the 7th year? So things can shift like that. So that could be where some of those numbers are being off. But it seems to me there's just fundamental issues with Rav Hul's chronology. So, for example, what do you think caused the war between Xenophon and the Greeks?
What do I think? I mean, can you clarify the question when you say what caused the war between them?
Yeah, because we know, right, we have lots of different Greek sources about the Second Greco-Persian War. Right? We know basically he was angry about the First Greco-Persian War, right, where so initially, right, there's some Greek cities in Anatolia that are taken over by the Persians, and there's a revolt, and this is the Ionian Revolt. And then as a result, that then causes a war to end up happening under Darius between Athens and Persia, and this is where you get the Battle of Marathon and so on. And later on under Xerxes, he basically comes to retake areas and go invade. But if Alexander, right, comes in the middle of Darius's reign and conquers all of Persia, how is Xerxes getting to Greece even in the first place? And why would he even have a motivation? You would think retaking the areas that were actually directly controlled by Persia would be a much bigger concern for him than retaking some small Greek city-states at the edge of an empire he doesn't even have anymore.
Well, I think that's a good question, but I also don't think that it's necessarily contradictory, because I mean the fact that in the Hul's understanding of how we realign the kind of extended Greek and Persian empire, these two empires exist simultaneously with each other, and so I think that broadly correlates. Now in terms of how exactly the battles are unfolding and how territory is able to be taken or attacked these are fine points and details which definitely need to be understood, but it's also not something which we have strong archaeological evidence of, precisely where and, the boundaries and how, like troop movements would be able to be occurred. Like, I mean, these are things which I would be like, that's a good question, but it's also not like hard to necessarily come up with explanations if we weren't like, to spend a lot of time, grounded, in the sources. Like, I don't like there's room for obviously continued conflict between the two empires, within his calculations. So I don't really see it as a fundamental challenge here. It's an interesting question, but it doesn't necessarily mean like that, like this should be thrown away, especially in light of all of the compelling evidence that we pointed out that like, that like there's like, like just massive lacunas of like presence of, Greek and Persian documents in the areas where that, both of them should have had an extended reign if we really want to suggest that like there was a contiguous Greek empire, that was, had conquered all of Persia, post facto. So like to me, like there's, the level of evidence that we have to be able to make the assessments based on the historical records of Xenophon, it doesn't necessarily like stand, like I hear your question, but it doesn't really stand up as like compelling, like, oh yeah, that's defeated.
The issue is though, is that it isn't just like Herodotus or Xenophon or Thucydides, right? It's that we have lots of other records, right? So, for example, Aristophanes, right, writes his drama, The Clouds, which has Socrates in it. And there's also, we know from other sources at the time, right, this is connected with the vilification of Socrates in connection with the fact that his students were involved in the 30 tyrants who took over Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War. So this clearly links like Plato and Socrates to a certain time period. We know from lots of different records that Aristotle was initially a student of Plato.
Wait, can I pause and ask you a quick question? What does Aristophanes' The Clouds, how does that in any way, shape, or form help us like actually establish an absolute chronology, not a relative chronology, but an absolute chronology?
So what I think is the issue is what I'm getting at is that Aristotle, we know, right, from Aristotle himself, he's the teacher of Alexander the Great. So you have, the thing is you can't put things in the right order. We have clear chronological markers that Alexander has to come after the time of Socrates. And we know that Socrates lived through the Peloponnesian Wars. So you can't make a chronology that works in any sensible order. Because we have lots of independent documents. There would essentially have to be, right, a forgery of all of ancient Greek literature in order to not have all these interlocking mentions of people over the course of a 200-year period. That's going to place us in a chronology that places Xerxes and Artaxerxes very clearly before the time of Alexander.
Yeah, no, I hear that point. I definitely hear that point. But and again, I just go back to like that's an interesting point of evidence, and it's not necessarily like it would stand in contradiction to what I'm suggesting for the Seder Olam, but also the Seder Olam, as I've just pointed out, continues like you have to also acknowledge that like the conventional chronology is doing an awful job of being able to date these Elephantine papyri. Like it's definitively better, to look at to use the Seder Olam chronology in order to understand these documents. Unless you want to suggest that these scribes were like totally incapable of like doing it. So like, yeah, there's contradictory evidence on both sides and compelling evidence on both sides. So which side should we adopt as religious people who have texts which clearly align with one chronology over the other? Like, it's like, you're asking good questions. I hear them, and I don't have necessarily all the answers. I have suspicions, and I have potential answers to give, but I'd rather just say, listen, there's evidence here and there's evidence there, and the evidence is very compelling on both sides. In fact, I would say the evidence is more compelling about the Seder Olam when you ask, when it's going to be my turn, I'm just going to, hammer you with the same kind of questions with the equal degree of severity, and then you're going to be left with the same question that I have, which is, all right, well, I'm a religious person and I have a text, I have a work of prophecy, which clearly is on one side of the fence of this debate. So which one should I be motivated and desiring to make right, and to actually believe in, given the fact that this is a highly speculative field, regardless.
So maybe we should move then to the prophecy, right? This is actually turning almost into an issue of Daniel 11 there, right? But it seems
and 8. Don't forget 8.
Yeah, yeah, but it seems somewhere right between Daniel 11:35 and 11:45, there's a large jump of time, right? So wherever you want to understand the verse in Kings, in the king in verses 36 to 39, right? There's this king who magnifies himself, right? Whoever that is, right? It's very clear that the events right before that are referring to the Hasmonean revolt, and the events afterwards are referring to some time at the end, which no one agrees on what that is. But everyone agrees there's a large gap of time here. So if there can be a large gap of time here, why can't there be a large gap of time between the Persian kings and the Greek king who comes to attack the Persians?
Because back in because 11:2 is very sad. The Persian will have 3 more. He's talking to Darius the Mede. Now, I can ask you, who exactly do you think Darius the Mede is? I'm going to say what Hul's conclusions are, which is that it's basically this is Kurash. His name was Darius, as Seder Olam had kind of indicated, and Darius was his first name. That became like Caesar subsequently. It became the name for Octavian, even though he wasn't actually named Caesar, as Josephus describes him. But he says that he will have 3 more kings right there. And the 4th, and like this is an area where, like, yes, you mentioned before that like prophecy can at times be poetic and at times it can be very literal, but here it's being very literal, and you're asking us all to read it very poetically, for the only reason being because you want the conventional chronology to be true, so that you can try and kind of shove it in chapter 9, the Jesus narrative, which like we shouldn't be adopting, and this is part, and this part is so explicit, so it's like why, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I want to read the verses and show where I think that's not the case. It says, "And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up against all the kingdoms of Greece." So depending on how you count Persian kings, right, this could be Darius or Xerxes there. All right, but so one of them stirs up Greece. This is probably Darius, right, who starts getting into fights with the Greek city-states there. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, do according to his will. So this is from what I assume is Alexander, right, who comes and invades there. So all right, so there's a 4th king who stirs up Greece, and then there's a king who arises according to his will. It doesn't say he then has to attack that 4th king. It just says he arises after that. And that's because, right, if Persia had not gotten involved with the Greek city-states, if Darius had essentially left the Greek city-states alone during the Ionian Revolt, probably Alexander never would have crossed over and tried to seek revenge on Persia there. So this is a very clear event, which is the turning point of Persian history and the eventual downfall of Persia. So that's why Daniel highlights it there, right? There has to be a rich king who stirs up Greece against Persia, but that's what's relevant to the prophecy. It doesn't say there are no more Persian kings after that.
No, of course, we're not arguing, we're not disputing that there aren't more Persian kings. That's the whole point. We agree that the 2 kingdoms live side by side, one next to the other. But Daniel is talking to Darius the Mede, who, we're going to say is Cyrus. Let's just say it's Cyrus because whatever. Like 3 more, kings after that. Maybe Bardias being included, whatever. The point is that like a Greek warrior king comes, his kingdom gets split into 4. Daniel here, it's being as explicit, and then as you pointed out, like all the subsequent verses are referring to the machinations of the various Greek, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and everything happening after that is clearly like the Greek period happening. So we are these verses in Daniel, there's no room to make a to then insert hundreds of years of distinction. That's my point.
But everyone agrees, right, that somewhere between verses 35 and 40, there has to be a big period of time.
But what does that have to do with verses 2 and 3 and 4?
The point is that on other places in Daniel 11, there are large gaps of time inserted, and so we can insert another gap of time here as well. There's nothing against it. So if you were most historians, right, who think this is a forgery, the reason they say that is they say, all right, up to verse 35, it goes pretty much year by year, and then all of a sudden it predicts a bunch of events that are later have to be reinterpreted to other later events. But they'll say Daniel predicted what was going to happen in the next few years after he wrote this, and he got it all wrong. But if we accept the view, which has been the traditional Christian and Jewish view, that there can be a gap of time between verse 35 and what happens in verses 40 onwards, then we can say there could also be a gap of time earlier as well. But I want to move on, because I only have a few minutes here. I want to get to some other points as well.
Please. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
So it does not seem. Do you think that Daniel 9 is messianic? Or do you think this is a prophecy about the Messiah?
There are absolutely components of it which are pointing ultimately to the messianic. This is the messianic end.
So, do you agree that there's this big messianic fervor in the first century?
Yes.
Yeah. So why is there that big messianic fervor? If it's not the fact that people are thinking that Daniel predicts the year of the coming of the Messiah.
I think that it could just very easily be attributed. I mean, first of all, there is messianic fervor in many periods throughout Jewish history, as you well know, right? Going all the way down to Sabbatai Tzvi, and so to say that it was unique to the first century, of course, would not be anything special. And not only that, the various commentators of have commentaries have all done their best to kind of like point out like, no, actually, it's our period that's going to like you could expect to see the Messiah come. Usually, it happens around a time of great turmoil, just like in Spain, the Abarbanel projected that like the 2300 years that's being referred to back in Daniel 7 is referring to is in fact referring to is referring to basically his time. And so, and certainly during the period of the late Second Temple was a time of incredible duress. And so, yes, throughout history, every time you see that, so it doesn't have to be because they were interpreting Daniel. And what sources do we have to actually suggest that beyond our speculation?
So, it also seems though in Daniel, right, the beginning of the prophecy, it gives a whole list of things that are going to happen, such as bringing in everlasting righteousness. So how were those accomplished in the Jewish view?
They have not yet been accomplished.
But it says, right, that these weeks are for this purpose.
So yeah, so that's why you have to go into so the very first verse is kind of like a headliner, and it captures all of history, and then it breaks it down more concretely. But we see that it's going to be, but we understand it very that's the just to pull it up. So in Kapdalad, yes, in Empire, it's 24. Yeah, like when it says Lim Shoich Kodesh Kodashim, that is referring to the end of time. But how is it going to proceed? How is this 490 going to work? Well, we're going to have we had the 7 weeks prior, then the 62 weeks, and then but it's going to be a time of distress, and then ultimately it's going to culminate in more destruction, right? And then after that period of destruction will ultimately come the final redemption. That's, so 24 is kind of the headliner, and then it's kind of broken down over the course of 25 to 27.
But if it's the case, right, that this is not going to, that this is saying, right, there's going to be destruction, there's not going to be the Messiah coming in this 490 years, because it seems that the Jewish reading is this is the 490 years when the Messiah is definitely not going to come. But we see then there wouldn't have been messianic fervor during the first century because the years had not been completed yet, right? If the prophecy is saying the Messiah cannot come until after the destruction of the temple, then that wouldn't work either.
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, there was messianic fervor all the way up to, Bar Kokhba. Rabbi Akiva himself thought that Bar Kokhba could have been the Messiah. So, like, there was messianic fervor happening, all throughout the first century, prior and post the destruction of the Second Temple. And as I pointed out, it doesn't have to be. There's nothing compelling us to link it to the fact that it's Daniel, or that they were even that this was related to Daniel. We know that there's prophesied to be a Messiah, of course. And in times of great duress, we expect, we're hoping that it's going to result in his coming because things are getting really heavy and they're getting really scary and things are bad. Just like in the time of Shabbat.
The issue, though, right, is if the Jewish interpretation of Daniel is correct, that means the Messiah could not come before the destruction of the Second Temple. But we see that there was messianic fervor before as well, right? So you could easily take it that, all right, they think this is the 490 years. All right, it's just completing. Because, as you mentioned, right, and the Seder Olam is written around this time as well. So clearly the Jews do not have very detailed records of exactly how many years it is, because the Jews are having to turn back to Daniel and stuff to try to reconstruct this chronology. So I don't think people were sitting around with exact year calculations at the time, but we're thinking, all right, sometime around this time.
Yeah, but I would, that you're probing and you're really pushing on this point. I would just kind of push back and go like, well, who cares what the rabble rouser were doing at this time? What if they were wrong? You know, like just because there was fervor, that doesn't make anything theologically true. Today, you know, there is like, you know, there are vast chunks of the Jewish people who think that like it's okay to have gay marriage. You know, it's like, and this is part of their rabble and their pushback. Like that doesn't make them right. Doesn't make them correctly interpreting the Torah. Like just because people are you know doing, like, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is indicative that this was that this was somehow, you know, indicative of Daniel in particular, or that this wasn't just a reflective of general, you know, duress during the time period, as I said. You know, I'm not compelled by what you're saying here to say like, oh, now let me reread, you know, Daniel, you know, according to what you're saying.
That was it's been 20, guys. I don't know if you want to continue with this line of questioning or if you wanted to.
It's only fair. I took so much time in the beginning, sorry.
We can switch over. I'm good with that.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I mean, like, listen, I thought that your questions were really nice on the Greco-Persian area, and that, you know, that is kind of, I think, like the weak point in part of his argument. So I'm glad that you figured that out. I thought I was going to be able to, but again, I was couching this, and I have been couching this in the perspective of like, yeah, there's compelling evidence on both sides, and we have to ask ourselves as Jews and as Christians, which one is actually better, you know, since it's an open-ended question, and since there are vagaries of time and it doesn't necessarily sit well, we want to be able to create we want to create the firmest foundation possible, and have our prophets be on as firm as footing as possible, and embracing chronologies and academic ideas which contradict the validity of the Torah and the prophets is going to be very challenging. And so I'm going to pose to you now the question, as I kind of asked it before, you know, or I'll you know, I'm just going to push back on the evidence right here. How do you understand the fact that these Elephantine papyri are being dated? And if you want, I can throw up, you know, I'll share my screen actually, because I think it might be better than what was loaded into the thing. But how do you understand the fact that these documents just align so much better when you plug in the Julian calendar date of Xerxes starting, you know, in 300 as opposed to 471?
Yeah, so a big issue here, right, is for the most part, right, for our chronology, being inaccurate by a day or by a year or two is not a big deal. But when you're trying to find exact matches like you are here, right, then that's going to all of a sudden be a huge deal, even if you're a single day off. Because even, right, Parker and Duberstein agree that this can be off by a single day, right? And I think they're a little bit making too big of a claim when they say one day. I think it's much more likely by a year or two off. Because I brought up the example, right, of, all right, when are the Jews counting the years of Persian kings? Because the Jewish calendar, right, starts in Nisan versus the Persian calendar is going to start in the fall, if I remember correctly. So there's going to be little issues like this that might throw calculations off. And we know, right, the Jewish calendar has changed in little ways at lots of times in history. So we would also have to know, how were the Elephantine Jews counting all these things? We know very little about the Elephantine Jews. So I agree there can be little bits, but I want to know.
Well, okay, so let me
trying to find exact matches, and that's where the difficulty comes in.
Yeah, but so that's precisely why I think, yeah, maybe you're misunderstanding the evidence and just why this is such a compelling thing. Because if like this is comparing the Babylonian date with the Egyptian date, and the Egyptian date is working on a solar calendar; those are fixed intervals, and the Babylonian date is the lunar solar calendar that I think you're mentioning, but I don't think necessarily even the audience understands how it works. It's a 19-year cycle where we insert an additional month every few years in order to make the two calendars align. Like the Muslim calendar, for example, is a strictly lunar calendar, and so therefore it's slowly receding because it's a 354-day year as opposed to the solar calendar, right? It's constantly receding into back. Now so these documents present us with a they're so valuable because they give us the ability to test our theory of when exactly these years should be dated. So you're suggesting, hey, like it could be that 470, maybe it's 471, maybe it's 472. That's an interesting question. And by the way, I was wondering if you were going to figure this out, like this, like maybe we should be testing other years surrounding that as well. But this was being done, this whole calculation was done by Bezalel Porten, and as you said, it was the way that the way they framed it is like it's off by a day or not, but they feel that the conventional chronology is very closely adhered to, you know, this year. And when you do so, the intervals do not line up nearly as well as when it's under the Seder-Olam chronology. The Seder-Olam chronology much better fits these documents, because scribes were writing these documents in real time. They were writing the actual dates. These were people who, this was their job. This is their full-time job. They would be writing these documents, these legal documents, and recording them. And the idea that they're going to somehow mess up their own calendars, you know, and not know what day it is, you know, it begs credulity. And so, you know, I just like, I'm confused as to how, you know, how one could like not look at this and go, wow, okay, you know, clearly there's compelling evidence. Like, do you acknowledge that this is compelling evidence for the Seder-Olam chronology? Let's just start there.
I think this is an interesting point you've brought up, right? But I think when you're looking at such a large range of data, it's very easy to find one piece that's going to have a bunch of false positives matching it. But it seems to me this is not, because there's certain things, all right, where there's little difficulties here and there of, all right, is our calendar off by a year or something? But that's not as big to me as the fact that Greek history ceases to make any coherent sense, where we have lots of detail. So to me, it's one thing when you want to shift around dates by a few years. It's another thing when 100% of our records stop making any coherent sense.
Yeah, but you can't acknowledge that this is a definitively better way to fit a bunch of documents. And if the conventional chronology was true, it should be doing much better than being like in the middle. Like it's in the middle of the pack, right? It's not even like out competing like any of these other randomly selected years. And like you said, there are noise in other years. This is the whole distribution of all the years. We did 50 different years. We tested 50 different Julian calendar years. And the one that performs the absolute best is the Seder-Olam chronology. It's 2.1 standard deviations at best. And again, my score is actually, I think it's actually higher, because I wasn't being as unfavorable as I could have been to, to the conventional chronology and to all these other years surrounding it. So you know, the idea that this is not compelling to you is very strange to me, because it's basically like saying, I hear your whole, like, you have a question. I don't understand how Aristotle works out with Alexander the Great and with the fact that he's a student of Plato. You know, okay, that's a question. Yeah, is it such a profound question? Was it, you know, like is it, you know, are these things that, you know, like is it absolute? Are there ways that we could not possibly explore? Like we haven't even considered all the avenues of thought, because we've just assumed the conventional chronology forever. But if you have compelling evidence now that the Seder-Olam chronology is correct, and it aligns with your own religious text, why are you not more embracing of it? You know, except to save the Jesus narrative.
So I think the issue is, right. So if, let's say, for example, your calculations were correct, let's say the Seder-Olam chronology is correct. At first of all, I don't think it would necessarily, right, destroy Christianity or anything. It would just weaken this particular argument.
Yeah, exactly. And that's my point. By the way, that's my point. I want to say, I'm not here trying to undermine your faith. I'm only trying to say that don't read Daniil that way, because it creates so many other problems of categorical catastrophe. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so on your question here, the reason I'm actually convinced of the conventional chronology is initially I was of the opinion that the 490 years had to be started with Cyrus. And so I was looking to try to remove like 70 years or so of Greek history to try to get Cyrus to align with Jesus. And then I realized, wait, this doesn't work at all. There's actually really, really good evidence for the conventional chronology. And then I discovered this Artaxerxes view, and I felt the exegesis was actually better for it. But so I do think, right, if, let's say, the Elephantine papyri was the only piece of evidence we had, right, then all right, that would be very convincing. But the reason it's not is you can always, when there's 8 or 9 or 10 different lines of evidence for something, it's very easy to pick out one of them that all of a sudden matches with it, right? This is what people will do all the time when they're trying to sort of push a pseudoscientific view, is that they'll pick out one particular piece of evidence and go, this is funny. But we have to look at all the lines of evidence. We can't just look at one line of evidence and ignore all the others.
Couldn't agree with you more, which is why I brought not just the Elephantine papyri, although I think that's the most compelling argument, but I also brought you the fact that the Babylonian cuneiform data, metadata, shows like a significant drop-off from Darius to Xerxes. What could possibly account for that? I also brought you evidence showing that there was a gap. There's a 3-year gap between Darius and Xerxes. What could account for that? Like, you know, these are compelling lines of evidence. And like we have Alexander, you know, being, you know, a king and and like he's, you know, Artaxerxes, like, you know, Arceus, you know, who's Artaxerxes, like this, like he can't, like Alexander isn't due on the scene till Darius III. So what is he doing, like hanging out with Artaxerxes? And they go, oh well, this must have been Artaxerxes IV. But then you have like, you have this single like line of text leaping like 5 years, like it doesn't read, the text doesn't read correctly. It's in the present tense. You know, like there are lots of compelling lines of evidence to suggest Seder Olam. And so I'm not just highlighting one thing, I'm highlighting a whole wealth of evidence. And again, I'm going back to this point, which is that, so, you know, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. You want to respond?
Yeah, I want to look at, can you go back to the slide of the intercalary gap?
Absolutely.
Okay,
yeah,
so,
this is the
so
one
you're saying there's a 3-year gap here?
Yeah.
Between Xerxes and who else?
And Darius the First.
Okay. Because I'll pull up on screen right now what I have here. Because I can't, I don't know about this one in particular, but I can give, oh, did Tractatus drop off by accident? I'll wait for him to get back into the studio before I pull this. Oh.
Yeah, it looked like it dropped out with the slide as well.
I'll just get this on screen so it's ready. Oh, there he is.
I had a boomer moment. I accidentally left as opposed to just canceling this.
Yeah. No problem here. So I don't know the exact source you have for this, but it has, so this is Parker and Duberstein here. It lists 1, 2, 3, 4 tablets we have for certain in Babylon of the end of the reign of Darius. And then one here that may have been damaged partly. So this one, so we have really, our fourth one is damaged. So we have 3 certain, 1 less so. And then we have here 2 tablets it lists for the beginning of Xerxes' reign. Now, I don't have those tablets on hand. You list the sources at the beginning of it. So I would have to go and actually pull up from an academic library all those tablets because I don't have access to them.
Yeah, I know. We don't have access to either of them. Yeah. And so I'll fill you in on like why exactly this is why this is so problematic, right? Because if you look at all the different calendar dates and the calendar months that you see for Xerxes in his final year, you see him going all the way up to the 12th month, even though the month of accession for Xerxes was actually before that. Right, so like you end up with contradictions in terms if you understand that these men had a succession that was in the same year, and the really what's happening in the what the proof is. You have to look at these documents. You have to, I'll explain this a little bit better, I think, because I didn't explain this well the first time. Basically, every several years you're adding in an intercalary month. And so when you see a document which has like Adar Sheni or Elul Sheni, that is to say the second month of Adar or the second month of Elul, then that means that year they made into an intercalary month. Now, once you string all those, if you can see all of those, years and documents in which those happened, you can reconstruct where you are in the 19-year cycle. And because the people in question all had reigns, like Xerxes 21 years, Artaxerxes 41 years, Darius II 19 years, we're able to precisely map out where we are in the 19-year cycle for each of these individuals. And then also with Darius, because Darius was also king for 36 years. Now, because of those things, you're able to see that Xerxes was extended in the 16th year of the cycle, but Darius's last year was in the 12th year of the cycle. That's a 3-year gap, but that already exposes, again, that the Ptolemy canon cannot be technically correct, and that there must have had something happen during this time period. What was it? Well, Seder Olam provides a very compelling reason. Daniel provides a very compelling reason. It's called Alexander the Great coming in and knocking out the Greeks. So knocking out the Persians. So that's, these are like the lines of evidence, and it's not just based on one thing, not just the Elephantine papyri. It's based on, these other documents. We're using the same exact documents you and I are citing, but I'm pointing out, deeper investigation and analysis of these documents reveals information, metadata, which we didn't previously understand or think about, that lends credence to the Seder Olam's interpretation of events. Because the vast majority of the documents that you and I are talking about, we only understand them vis-a-vis relative dating. We don't understand them in terms of absolute terms. And that absolute terms is the question mark that we're trying to answer, and that the Seder Olam provides an answer to. And if you don't accept the Seder Olam, you're ultimately, providing, you're basically undermining the book of Daniel. So that is, I'll end my cross-ex there.
Yeah. I will say for some of these, I tried to get my hands as best I could on Rav Hull's book so I could go through all of this before the debate. And unfortunately, it's out of print, not for sale anywhere in America. So I couldn't, unfortunately. But it seems to me, right, when I look at like other people talking about this, people aren't pointing out these issues. They're not to say those issues aren't there, right? So I've looked much more into, for example, Egyptian chronology. And I know there are lots of issues with Egyptian chronology that are often ignored by the mainstream establishment. So that's why, for example, I used to be much more favorable towards revising Persian history. But it seems to me those issues that are present in Egyptian history are not present in the same way in Persian history, and especially in Greek chronology. And that's the thing that leaps out to me, is this interlocking record with Greek history as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to that, I mean, I don't know where we're at right now, because I'm happy to kind of like to pause my my counter arguments, or the I guess we're in the cross-check phase. But basically the reply is very, yes, you're right, by the way. The Egyptian chronology has a whole lot of problems, and if you just embrace the the strictly academic view, then the Torah is almost totally incomprehensible.
I agree,
in terms of the timeline. You can't do it. So like, we as religious individuals who all agree that the Torah is from God, and that his prophets were divinely inspired, and the prophecies are presenting us are true. We have it behooves us to find and align with systems that, which is what I'm suggesting is kind of radical in a way, because I'm basically saying you should use your faith to steer again, to kind of chart a path. But as I pointed out from the beginning, the whole subject of biblical history or archaeology, and this time period in general, it's so much more of a speculative science than physics and mathematics, and which is kind of like my background, and so we're not. I feel like we should be less beholden to, yes, you have some interesting and good questions, but you also have very confounding ones if you do embrace, if you just adopt the conventional chronology whole cloth.
Yes, I maybe want to make one last point here. I think what you bring up, I mostly agree with, right? That we cannot fully accept conventional chronology if we're going to accept that the Torah is true. It contradicts our Egyptian chronology. But I'm not so convinced that. I used to be of your opinion that we do need to revise Persian history, but as I looked into it, I was just not convinced by, especially as radical of a revision as the Seder Olam puts forward. And I want to give maybe a theological reason this is, right? Because we see up until the Babylonian exile, we basically get a year-by-year blow from creation all the way through to the Babylonian exile, right? And so I think at this time, the recording of world history is in the hands of the people of Israel. And then we see in the book of Daniel that sovereignty is now being handed over to these four empires that are going to come. And so I think we see this in our world records as well, that up until the Babylonian exile, our records are going to have to be the people of Israel. We have to interpret everything in light of that. And that's why all the history books are there in scripture, at least in part. Versus at this point, once dominion is handed over to Babylon, now we have to look to these nations in order to get the full details for our chronology.
All right. So guys, how are we doing on, I want to make sure you both have enough. I know there was a few time constraints. I want to make sure you guys both have enough time for your 10-minute closing statements. We have a few questions here, but
I can go for as long as we need to. I don't know if Tractatus has limitations.
I do. Yeah. So I have a hard stop at 10 in a half hour. So I feel like we're right on track, basically. 10-minute conclusions, and then some time for questions. I think would be good.
All right.
I thought we were going to do 10 minutes of questions first and then do our conclusions.
Yeah, 10 minutes questions and then conclusion.
Okay.
So the first question, big question for Gideon, is why the destruction of the Second Temple is more significant than the destruction of the first?
Yeah, so I think my this position would be a lot less coherent, right? If, for example, let's say Bar Kokhba had been the Messiah. But I think there's something fundamentally different in a 70-year period without a temple versus a 2,000-year period without a temple. Because the time from the construction of the first tabernacle under Moses all the way until the destruction of the temple right? That was about 1,500 years or so, give or take a little bit more or less, depending on how you add it up. There's been now over 1,900 years, going up close now to 2,000 years without a temple. So you would have to say that the period without the temple is longer than the entire period of time with the temple. I also think, let's say Jesus had not come in and not instituted a new covenant, and we would still been in the old covenant. Perhaps at that point, right, the Jewish view would make the most sense, and we should all follow Judaism, or at least be Noahides if you're not actually Jewish. But I think given the fact that Jesus came, he established the Catholic Church, and now has brought the knowledge of God to the whole world through the Catholic Church, has instituted a new sacrifice through the sacrifice of the Mass, that we have clear signs that the old covenant has been fulfilled, and it's not merely this break.
All right, Tractatus, do you have any follow-up on that?
No, not really. Except to, all I'll say is that I think that the mere fact that the time from which the Second Temple has been destroyed is and it's taken so much longer to get our third temple in place, is a significant cause for introspection. And the Jewish people continue to experience tragedies, throughout history. On the 9th of Av, the date of which both of temples were destroyed. This is like when the Jews were expelled from Spain, and lots of other nasty things have happened since then. So I think that it's very clear that Hashem has continued to show that the Jewish people still haven't rectified what we need to do in order to get a third temple built, but by no stretch of the imagination is it off the table or indicative of anything other than the fact that we have failed as a nation and as individuals to really accomplish the spiritual mission that is still incumbent upon us and has not changed since then, since the time of Moses.
I'll agree in part with that, because I do think ultimately, right, that in this view, right, in the Catholic view, we still think that the Jewish people have been preserved in their existence for a reason. And part of that reason is that the Jewish people will ultimately come to accept, as we believe, the Catholic faith. And so, like it says in our catechism, for example, that Christ will not return until the Jews convert. This doesn't mean some sort of special thing that we got to convert the Jews to end the world quickly or something like evangelicals do. But we do recognize, I think, an ongoing important role for the Jewish people in world history, that the covenant has not been revoked, that there is still some importance there.
All right, to Tractatus. Since Daniel is expounding upon Jeremiah's 70 years after which the Messianic era would enter, this means by the end of the weeks of Daniel, Messiah should have come. Where is he?
So I think we touched upon this a little bit. So the way that we understand those verses in Daniel is that there's going to be there's the 70 weeks, 490 years. 70 weeks is, the first 7 weeks is up till the point of Cyrus, and then we get, roughly speaking, 420 years of, the Second Temple period. But as I pointed out from the beginning of the verses, it talks about that's, and then the last verses 26, 27 details the destruction, but then the ultimate coming of the end, which was kind of foreshadowed in the verse 23. So there was it wasn't incumbent that the Messiah had to appear right after the destruction of the temple. It's merely going to happen at some point in the future. When does that happen? That's part of the, the mystery and difficulty of Daniel in the earlier chapters in 7, where he's, where we're handed the 2300, the time, half a time, there's other passages which allude to when exactly the final redemption is going to be taking place. And many have tried to calculate, and none so far have been successful. But that is the difficulty associated with this work. But we're not compelled to say that the Messiah had to come at the end of the 490 years.
All right, getting any follow-up on that?
Yeah, I'll maybe add, it does seem to me that this is a prophecy of when the Messiah will come, because this is the years where these 6 things have to be accomplished. Right? Because Daniel prays. Let me read a verse out of his prayer, if I can pull it up real quick here. I shouldn't have removed my bookmark. But when Daniel is praying to Gabriel, right before Gabriel arrives and gives him this prophecy, he says, "Oh my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and behold our desolation in the city which is called by your name. For we do not present our supplications before you on the ground of our righteousness, but on the ground of your great mercy." So if it was, right, if the Jewish people had to be perfectly righteous for the Messiah to come, the Messiah is never going to come. But if we understand that God promised, right, the Messiah is going to come in this time, regardless of whether or not you're righteous, right, what happened? A positive prophecy is always fulfilled. This is an important principle of rabbinic interpretation. And so I think the Messiah came. What happened is our people were not being faithful, and so we didn't see him when he came. He came, but we did not recognize him. And so that's why we've been sent back into exile again, is until we come and recognize him.
All right. So just sort of a general one here. Do either of you have any books you would recommend on Jewish and Christian dialogue and apologetics?
I would recommend, first of all, just in terms of Catholic side, there's not really one good book that I think puts everything together. But I'd first say just familiarize yourself with what the church has actually taught on Judaism, both before and after Vatican II. Because there's sort of this meme that goes around that before Vatican II, there was negative about the Jews. After Vatican II, it was positive about the Jews. But I don't think that's really accurate. I think there's a lot more nuance in it. Because even before Vatican II, in the Middle Ages, popes constantly put out encyclicals telling people to stop harming Jews, because they are still the people of the Old Covenant there. And they still have this role to play within divine providence. In terms of apologetics materials, I think there's not one good resource from a Catholic perspective. Lawrence Feingold has put out 3 books that are quite good and helpful that I would recommend maybe starting with from a Catholic perspective, as well as Father Antoine Levy's book, Jewish Church, which is about the role of Jewish Christians within the Catholic Church. In terms of more apologetic stuff, one really good book is Messiah ben Joseph by David Mitchell, where he talks about this figure in the Jewish tradition called the Messiah, the son of Joseph, who's a suffering and dying Messiah. And he shows that this goes all the way back to Scripture. It appears actually in the New Testament and the Church Fathers, as well as within the later Jewish tradition. As well as, I don't agree with him on everything, but Michael Brown's books do have a number of good points, but he does contradict Catholic dogma on a number of spots as well, so do be careful with his works.
Yeah, I'm not such a, I guess I don't have as much expertise on in the kind of classic works of apologetica. There are some people who have posted lots of materials online from the Jewish perspective that kind of work against the, kind of argue against the Christian narratives that are out there. I can share the link afterwards in the debate, or I'll post it in the comments. Somebody had shared to me. I thought it was an interesting resource, but I didn't have time to delve into it thoroughly myself.
All right. So do you guys want to go ahead and start moving into the closing statements?
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Yeah.
I'll let y'all decide who wants to go first.
I've been making decisions, so Gideon, I'll let you choose.
I can go first, and then we keep the order of what we've been doing before.
Okay.
When you're ready, Gideon.
All right. So, in Sanhedrin 98a, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asks Elijah when the Messiah will come. Elijah tells him to go ask the Messiah himself, as the Messiah is sitting at the gates of Rome, tending to the poor and sick there. Rabbi Yehoshua goes and meets the Messiah there. He asks the Messiah when he will come. The Messiah responds, today. However, when the Messiah does not come, Rabbi Yehoshua gets angry. Elijah clarifies that the Messiah was quoting Psalm 95, today, if you would listen to his voice. Well, this in no way proves Catholicism. I think it actually does nicely reflect the teachings of Daniel 9. I think, as I've demonstrated, Daniel 9 describes a Day of Atonement-like event, which brings in a new covenant. And there's a cutting off of an anointed one for someone else that I think pretty clearly would occur 483 to 490 years after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And I think we can see from secular records, which it's not just one little bit of evidence here or there, but all sorts of different records, as well as the fact that we just cannot make Greek history make any sense if we don't have something at least close to conventional chronology. But I think this decree came in 457 BC. This places the time of these events around AD 27 to 33, which is exactly in the range that all scholars agree the ministry and crucifixion of Jesus occurred. That Jesus instituted a new sacrifice through his death, and this is represented to us through the sacrifice of the Mass. Right? It's notable that over half, or I think more around half, the laws that were given to Moses are unable to be kept now because there is no temple. Versus in the church, we now have this temple, right? Christ came and he instituted a new temple and priesthood, and he brought the old one to an end. And this is signified by the destruction of the temple, as prophesied in Daniel. Now, Daniel elsewhere describes how this messianic kingdom would inherit the fourth kingdom, which is the Roman Empire. And I think it's very notable, right? You have to make some sense of human history that occurs after this. That 280 years after the completion of these 70 weeks, the Roman emperor himself bowed the knee to Jesus and converted to Christianity. The head of the Catholic Church sits in Rome, and for centuries, the Pope crowned the Roman emperor. Right? This would have been unthinkable in the early days of Christianity. That now the church has been brought out to the entire world. And I think in contrast, though, I think not only can the Jewish interpretation fail to explain the actual text of Daniel, which is about the coming of the Messiah, but the rabbis we saw, they had to falsify the chronology of world history by 165 years to make this interpretation fit. And as Tractatus himself said, if you can't make sense of the Seder Olam chronology, if it's not true, then all of Judaism falls with it. Maybe we'll touch on some particular objections here, which we did not get a chance to discuss. One of these big issues is the issue of how is Jesus a Nagid? But Jesus runs like the most successful empire in human history. Right? The Catholic Church is the largest landowner in the world now. I think this is a point I want to make to Jews, because I hear this a lot in Jewish Christian debates, is the way a lot of evangelicals understand the Messianic kingdom. Is they think Jesus came, he died, he did his priestly role, and then he's going to come back in the future as a king and establish his kingdom. And there's truth to that, but really his kingdom was established at Pentecost. And that the Catholic Church is that Messianic kingdom, which Jesus established. And so Jesus has a real rule. Right? There's a case, for example, a famous case in the Middle Ages, where the Holy Roman Emperor was disobeying the Pope. And so the Pope deposed him. And the Holy Roman Emperor had to walk over the Alps during the winter to go beg the Pope for his crown back. This is how much power the church had been given, that it actually inherited the kingdom, the fourth kingdom, the Roman Empire, and spread throughout the entire world. And so I want to point out, right, that the prophets Habakkuk and Isaiah say in the Messianic age that the knowledge of God would cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. Since the time of Jesus, billions of people have cast down their idols. The words of the prophet Jeremiah, the nations came from the ends of the earth and said, our fathers have inherited nothing but lies, worthless things which are of no profit. We see they began to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. 53% of the world's population now acknowledges a Jewish man as the promised Messiah of the Jewish people, because this is recognized by Christians and Muslims. We see 17% of the world's population, the Catholic Church, are public members of this Messianic kingdom. Each year now, tens of thousands of Gentiles from all over the world go to Jerusalem every year to celebrate the Passover because of a Jewish man and to celebrate this Jewish Messiah. All over the world, millions of Gentiles are studying the Tanakh because of this Jewish Messiah. Men inspired by him dedicated their entire lives, right? Going even further, Judaism does not have celibacy and asceticism. At least it does not anymore. We see it did have in the time of Jesus, but it does not anymore. But we now see, right, men giving up everything, giving up all earthly pleasures to go to the ends of the world to spread the message of this Jewish Messiah and to get pagans to cast down their idols and accept the God of Israel. And today now, there's something new really, is tens of thousands of secular Jews, such as myself, are coming to believe in the God of our ancestors because of this Jewish Messiah. I don't know Tractatus' story of how he came back to be a faithful Jew, but that's very rare. It's very rare that these secular Jews are coming back, and that's because the apologists who are coming and convincing secular Jews like myself of the existence of God, of the accuracy of the scriptures, it is Christian apologists. The reason that I came to believe in God in the first place is because of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. That's the only reason that I'm not an atheist today. And that's the reason that I came back and now care deeply about the scriptures that God gave to the Jews. And I think all of this evidence, it's so clear that even if you go to Maimonides, this great Jewish sage, he had to admit that although he thought Jesus was a false prophet, he must have been part of God's plan in bringing the knowledge of the Torah to the Gentiles. And while the Rambam saw in the Jewish rejection of Jesus a proof that he was not the Messiah, I think it's actually the Jewish rejection of Jesus that allowed the message to go to the Gentiles. It's because the apostles were not listened to by the Jews that they went out to the nations. But Jesus, when he's disputing with the Jewish leadership in Luke 13 and in Matthew 23, he says that when he returns upon the Mount of Olives, they're going to cry, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." This comes from Psalm 118. And we read right before that in Psalm 118, "The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." So the builders is the Jewish people who built the kingdom. They're the ones who end up rejecting the cornerstone, which is Jesus. And so we even see that the Jewish people's rejection of Jesus, even this is prophesied in our own scriptures. And I think this is part of God's plan, right? Because if the Jews had immediately accepted Jesus, we would have so much to brag about. Not only were we righteous before Jesus, we were doing everything right after Jesus. We almost done nothing wrong in history at that point. But we see that in God's plan, he wants it where there's a time where the Jews have him, or the time where the Gentiles have him properly. So that way, no one can boast that they're greater. And so that way, we can see that it was God's doing. As Daniel says, right? It's not our own righteousness, but it's the righteousness, it's his mercy that brought it about. And I know Jews listening to this, look, I know you're going to hear, you probably have objections in your head, like, don't Catholics worship three gods? Or didn't the Catholic Church support Hitler? Or things like that. I assure you there are good answers to these. I don't think these objections are accurate. But we don't have time to address them in this debate, obviously. So if any Jews would like to speak with me, please reach out to me on Twitter. You can find my email. I think it's on my YouTube page. Or it's my name, Gideon Jacob Lazar @gmail.com. Or comment below and we'll get in touch. So I want to ask all the Jews listening to this especially to turn to Daniel 9. Right? This is this great prayer that Daniel prays before the prophecy even comes, where he looks at the fact that the people are in exile, they have not been restored, and he prays for the restoration of Israel. And so I ask all of you as well to go and pray for the restoration of our people. Whether we disagree on whether this is going to be the first coming of the Messiah or a second coming, that we need to pray for this restoration. Because as we see, our people were cast out, unfortunately. And even those Jews who've returned to be living in Israel, they still recognize that they are in some sense living in Galut, not Geulah yet. So we still need to pray for this. And finally, I want to thank Tractatus for agreeing to debate me and for Brian to agreeing to moderate this debate. I think a lot of the discourse between Jews and Catholics online these days, first of all, it's very anti-intellectual, but it's also very vitriolic. And Jesus commands us to love even our enemies. If you think the Jews are your enemies, you still have a command to love them. Or even some people will say, oh, the Jews are actually descended from the Edomites. They're not descended from the ancient Jews. Well, there's a commandment in Deuteronomy to love the Edomites. You cannot despise the Edomite, for he is your brother. So no matter what you think on all these things, we have a commandment to love the Jewish people, to show them our love. That doesn't mean we have to agree on everything, right? I did not hold back, I think, in this debate with Tractatus from trying to bring him the message of the gospel. But we have to love them when we do it. And I think that this is the clear message of the teaching of the church, is that we have to love the Jews, but we also have to bring them the gospel. And I think while we have strong theological disagreements, and unfortunately there is a lot of historical baggage between us, what matters is truth. And we have to bring that truth in charity. We have a commandment to do that from God. And so I hope this can serve as a good model for future debates between Jews and Catholics. And so I thank you for both Tractatus for coming on, Brian for agreeing to moderate, and everyone for listening.
All right, Tractatus, your 10 minutes.
All right. Yes. So I just want to reiterate a bunch of the points as I stated from the outset, and how I still hold today, and I still hold at this moment. I don't think that anything has been demonstrated to move Jews away from the classic Jewish reading. Mashiach Nagid, but then subsequently Mashiach. He says that we established that Nagid must be referring to state power because that's what it's being used as in precisely the next pasuk, in the next verse. But Jesus never ran anything. Maybe the Catholic Church is extremely powerful today. They certainly have a lot of nice property in Israel, but it's not necessarily. It was never Jesus's, and there's no good reason to divorce the term Mashiach and Negid from each other, and the fact that the Negid is then being used to show state power and smash against the subsequent Mashiach tells you that we're talking about two different Mashiachs. Furthermore, the Ve'ein Lo, as he acknowledged, was very difficult for him. There was no, there's not, Jesus was resurrected according to Christianity. Ve'ein Lo means it's done, it's over, like Ve'ein, it's done, nothing is gone. And the Ikaris, right? That Ikaris doesn't necessarily even mean kill or die. It, in fact, the vast majority of its use throughout the Tanakh is meant to cut off something. Ikaris a bris, Ikaris. In Joshua, he uses the Gibeonites. He refers to them as Karis. It doesn't mean that it's killing. He means that they're getting cut off. He has to brush over the fact that at the end of the 62 weeks, all three things are happening. But then Jesus somehow, Jesus' death, which we all know happens 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple, that somehow gets lumped in. There's no justification for why we would do that. He arbitrarily breaks up the 7 weeks, and the subsequent 62 weeks, and emphasizes, well, we want it to be a jubilee, and we have to come up with flowery explanations for why exactly a jubilee applies. And certainly, he did mention the correct spiritual concepts that correspond with what happens in the Yovel, the jubilee. But there's why not 10 jubilees? We don't know. Well, with the Jewish reading, it makes a lot of sense because 7 weeks was precisely how much time it took from the destruction of the temple to when Cyrus came and made the proclamation that the Jews could return. Fits very well. And then 62 weeks of extended Jewish, time in Israel, although, as the pasuk points out, it's going to be a difficult and distressful time, as was the case, right? The not accepting, again, if you don't accept the Seder Olam, as he pointed out, yes, you have fundamental problems with the Torah. There's no, and the Daniel is particularly at threat precisely because the passages, yes, he makes prophecies, and some prophecies are very vague and very difficult to understand, but parts of it, there are parts of it which are very clear. And not only that, the angels take the time to explain it to us, what they mean. So they have and the parts that they choose to explain to us are precisely this discussion about the three kings being conquered by the Greeks and then getting split into 4 kingdoms. We all know that that's referring to Alexander and then his subsequent death and destruction, and then the 4 kingdoms of the Greek Empire that is spawned from him, and that happens after 3 Persian kings. And then you want to say, oh well, later on in towards the end, things get we leap over lots of years. So over here we can leap through lots of years, but that's simply just you're only saying that to justify after the fact. A simple reading of the verse does not allow you to take such liberties, and doing so is only to buttress an argument that we should be saying, reading chapter 9 as talking about Jesus, where we have to assert this 490 years and we have to divide it up. It's all to satisfy this end goal of making chapter 9 work. But you don't have to embrace any of that, and you're undermining the legitimacy of Daniel as a prophet in general. And certainly anybody who reads chapter 8 and chapter 11 and then looks at the chronology and then and says, well, okay, what is this referring to, is going to come away with the impression that this is talking about Alexander, and you're not going to be able to answer those questions. He had no response to the Elephantine papyri evidence, which we showed them the Seder Olam chronology absolutely demolished the conventional chronology in providing the accurate way to absolutely date those documents. There was no response to the 3-year gap. There's no response to the vast reduction in documents of Persian rule from Darius to Xerxes. Why should that have been? No explanation on why the Greek Empire seemingly left Persia untouched and did not have their own documents there, and why parts of Egypt were, clearly divided between the Greeks and the Persians for a continuous period. So all of these things are just massive lines of evidence which suggest the Seder Olam chronology. And again, I'm not saying that it's an airtight case and it's very straightforward. He asked very legitimate questions, and good for him for being knowledgeable of those questions, knowledgeable of that area in order to argue it. But it doesn't change the fact that these are all strong pieces of evidence for a chronology which you as Christians should want to embrace in order to make the prophets true. If you don't embrace them, then the prophets are false and they're delegitimized, and chapter 9 is thrown out the window anyway, because why would you accept anything Daniel has to say once vast parts of his prophecy are no longer true? The timeline does not work out. As we said, Daniel would have to be 136 by the end of Xerxes' reign. Ezra's father, who was Sariah, he was the Kohen Gadol at the time of the destruction of Beis Hamikdash. Ezra, his son, was also Kohen Gadol in the time of his Beis Hamikdash, and he would have to be, extremely old in order, he'd have to be, beyond beyond absurdly old in order to satisfy the the constraints of the conventional chronology of meeting with Artaxerxes as Gideon suggested. So for all those reasons, we have to reject this conventional chronology approach. We have to accept the Seder Olam chronology, and we should reject the proof that is being put upon us that this is referring to Jesus. We see no compelling reason in the text. We see no compelling reason from Seder Olam, and we're highly motivated to accept the Seder Olam, both because of evidence and also because of religious reasons. I want to thank Gideon. Oh, and I just want to point out, you said, like, that's very strange that a Jew should return to Judaism. There's actually an entire Baal Tshuva movement. Lots of people return to Judaism. I'm far from alone. There are entire yeshivas in Israel just dedicated to this purpose and have been for decades. And I view it as a sign of the times. I think that we are in the somewhere close to the end game, the Ikvas Mashiach, as it's referred to. And yeah, I agree with Gideon that, right now we need to be trying to increase, I think, the overall trends in the world, of secularization and are kind of pulling the broader religious community apart. Yes, we have our two faiths, are fundamentally irreconcilable for many, many reasons that we didn't even get to touch on. And we're certainly wisely outside the purview of this debate. But if you just look at the overall trends of America and the world at large, society is moving more and more in a secular direction and less God-fearing overall. And I think that there are many points of commonality in terms of our values and in terms of our outlook, in terms of the primacy of Kodesh Baruch Hu, of God in this world, that we can certainly rally together and advance and work together to advance those values, which are very much under attack under the kind of broader secularization of society. So I'm also happy to have this debate. I'm happy to have a rich discussion as this. I thought that Gideon did a nice job articulating his perspective and asked the right questions. It certainly didn't let me walk away with it, but nonetheless, I feel like the evidence I presented is compelling and it's not refuted, and so therefore I'm happy with this overall debate. I'm happy that we had the conversation. I'll just point out that I am going to be if you want to follow me, my handle on Twitter, you can look at you can see Gideon and I are responding back and forth. I'm going to be hopefully launching a podcast soon on the book of Samuel, which I'm very excited about. I've been working on for a long time. And I think that if you're, interested in Bible and Torah study, and also from an archaeological perspective, but a political and a spiritual and an understanding that, I think you'll enjoy it. So if you're interested in following that, feel free to follow me. So I will, you can be informed as that hopefully comes to fruition soon. I hope that everybody had a great time listening to this debate, and thank you, Brian, for moderating, and thank you, Gideon, for tolerating my extremely fast-paced East Coast voices in this whole conversation.
I think we both had the fast East Coast Jewish discussion here. I also mentioned, for people who are interested in following up, I'm going to be on Scholastic Answers tomorrow afternoon doing a debate review of this. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on, though.
Yeah, I appreciate both of you guys doing this. I think on behalf of myself and the audience, this was, really well put together. I think you both had mentioned that the, state of social media is the dialogue, it's kind of a race to the bottom, and it's sort of in an abysmal state. But you've both given us something to go back and listen to that's edifying and challenging, and a good, I think, example of a gentleman's debate. So I appreciate you both for doing this.
Yeah, and I want to point out to everyone who might be watching, like Tractatus at the end there, right? We share a common goal as Jews and Catholics, fighting against the godlessness that's in society today. There's this whole conspiracy that's going around nowadays that Orthodox Jews are supportive of abortion, or they're supportive of gay marriage, or they're supportive of the rise in atheism, and that's just not true at all. And so I figured, thank you for that mention at the end there.
Yeah, and thank you guys. Thank you very much. All right, well, I have a meeting in a few minutes, so I appreciate you guys, and I'll duck out now. Thank you so much, and yeah.
Thank you, and I'll end the stream here. Thank you, everyone, for watching.
Okay, take care.